Hey everyone, welcome back to Bald Voldemort. Get ready for an amazing tale. What if Harry was adopted by the Avengers and built a magic-powered infinity suit? Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1. Salvage. The thing about magic was that it didn't care about gas leaks. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s instruments picked up the energy signature at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, which was, according to Agent Maria Hill's later report, an inconvenient time for a Category 3 anomalous energy event in a Surrey suburb. The instruments flagged it as low priority. The follow-up team flagged it as something else entirely when they found the crater where number 4 Privet Drive used to be. The row of identical houses on either side stood untouched. Pristine hedges, clean windows, not a garden gnome out of place. Number 4 was simply gone, collapsed inward like something had reached down from the sky and pressed its thumb into the building. And in the middle of the rubble, sitting on a piece of load-bearing wall that had no business still being standing, was a boy. He was small for his age. The paramedic who reached him first put him at 5, maybe 6. He was actually 7. His glasses were cracked down the middle, held together at the bridge with a strip of electrical tape that had seen better days. His hair was a catastrophe. He was wearing a shirt 3 sizes too large and trousers that had been rolled at the ankles so many times the cuffs looked like donuts. He had a bruise along his left jaw that was older than the explosion. He was not crying, he was looking at his hands. "Hey," the paramedic said, crouching down carefully, picking her way through the debris. "Hey, sweetheart. Can you hear me? Are you hurt?" The boy looked up. His eyes were very green and very calm in a way that no child's eyes should be calm in the middle of a disaster site. "I didn't mean to," he said. The paramedic, whose name was Davies and who had been on shift for 11 hours, felt something cold move through her chest. "Didn't mean to what, love?" The boy looked back at his hands. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I never know." By the time Agent Phil Coulson arrived at Surrey General Hospital, the boy had been cleaned up, assessed for injuries that the doctors kept describing as inconsistent with blast trauma, and installed in a corner bed with a cup of orange juice he hadn't touched. The Dursleys, the paramedics had found Vernon Dursley's wallet in the rubble, and from there the family had been identified and located at the neighbor's house, had been asked if they wanted to come to the hospital. They had declined. The duty nurse had said with admirable restraint that she found that interesting. Coulson sat down in the plastic chair beside the boy's bed and didn't immediately say anything, which was, in his experience, always the better opening move with children. He just sat there with his hands folded in his lap and looked at the wall, and after about 45 seconds the boy looked at him sideways. "You're not a doctor," the boy said. "No," Coulson agreed. "You're wearing a suit." "I am. Doctors don't wear suits. Generally not." The boy's eyes tracked down to the slight rectangular bulk under Coulson's left arm. "Are you police?" "Something like that." The boy seemed to consider this. He picked up the orange juice, examined it, and put it back down. "Am I in trouble?" "Why would you be in trouble? I made the house fall down." Coulson kept his expression exactly where it was, which was the professional equivalent of an Olympic sport. "Do you know how you did that?" The word came out flat and practiced, like it was the answer he always gave to that question. "It just happens sometimes. He stopped, looked at the wall. "It just happens." Coulson pulled out his phone, not to use it, just to give his hand something to do that wasn't reaching out and doing something ineffectual like patting the boy on the shoulder. He'd read the paramedic's report in the car. He'd read the hospital intake form. He'd read the note the duty nurse had attached to the file that said, in terse clinical language, that the child presented with healed rib fractures, evidence of prolonged malnutrition, and contusions in various stages of healing that were not consistent with accidental injury. He'd also read the energy readout from the S.H.I.E.L.D. instruments. Two things together painted a picture that made something quiet and very cold settle in behind his sternum. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy blinked like the question surprised him. "Harry," he said, then after a pause like he was remembering a rule. "Harry Potter." "I'm Phil," Coulson said. "Do you want that orange juice or not? Because I could probably find you something better." Harry Potter looked at him for a long moment, then very carefully like he was waiting for the catch. "Like what?" "There's a vending machine down the hall," Coulson said. "I saw a Ribena on the way in." Something shifted in those green eyes, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "Okay," Harry said. The call to Director Fury happened in the hospital car park at 5 a.m. with Coulson's collar turned up against the early morning damp and a half-eaten vending machine sandwich in his other hand. "The energy signature is consistent with uncontrolled accidental magical discharge," he said without preamble, because Fury didn't appreciate preamble at 5 in the morning. "We're looking at a significant output for an untrained juvenile." The structural analysis of the house suggests the force originated from the boy's immediate location and radiated outward. Nothing in a 20-foot radius was touched. He protected himself, Fury said, unconsciously, yes. Silence on the line. Then the family. Coulson looked at his sandwich, put it in the bin. Currently being interviewed by Surrey police regarding the injury, separately from the explosion. He paused. The neighbor's statement is that the boy has been living with them for 6 years and she's never once seen him eat a meal at the family table. Another silence, longer this time. What's his status legally? Orphan, parents deceased when he was 15 months. The family are the only listed relatives. Who else knows about the energy signature right now? Us and one paramedic who I think is going to be very easily convinced that she misheard what the boy said. Coulson checked his watch. There's also the matter of what we found in the rubble, sir. Which is, letters, Coulson said. A significant quantity of letters, all addressed to the boy, all from the same source. An institution called Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He won't be 11 for another 4 years, but it appears someone's been sending correspondence ahead of time. Possibly for the last several months, given the volume. He paused. Someone knew about this child, sir. Someone's been watching him. The pause on Fury's end was of a very specific quality. It was the pause of a man doing calculations. Bring him in, Fury said, quietly. And the letters, bring those too. Coulson looked back up at the hospital window where a small dark-haired shape was visible through the glass, sitting on a bed very still, looking at his hands again. Yes, sir, he said. The decision to involve Tony Stark was, in hindsight, either a stroke of genius or an act of absolute institutional madness, and the SHIELD committee that reviewed it 3 years later was unable to reach consensus on which. In the moment, it made a certain practical sense. Tony Stark had recently made his tower publicly available as a base of operations for what was loosely being called the Avengers Initiative. He had also, at a press conference 2 weeks prior, announced, without clearing it with Fury, without clearing it with anyone, that the tower had more than enough rooms and frankly more than enough emotional bandwidth to function as what might be described as a home base, if anyone needed one. Pepper Potts had sat behind him at that press conference with the expression of a woman who had made peace with chaos. She was the one who answered when Coulson called. He needs a placement, Coulson said after giving her the short version. Long-term. Secure, someone who can handle the energy component and who has the resources to support a child with significant potential and a complicated background. You want Tony to adopt a child, Pepper said. I want you to consider whether the facility and the people therein might constitute inappropriate. Phil, Pepper said. Yes, you want Tony to adopt a child. Coulson looked at the ceiling of his car. The boy has nowhere else to go, Miss Potts. The extended family situation has been referred to Child Protective Services. The Hogwarts letters suggest an existing magical institution with an interest in the child, but we have no established protocol with that institution and no guarantee of his safety there. SHIELD can't place him in a standard foster environment, the liability from uncontrolled manifestations alone. Send me the file, Pepper said. Give me 2 hours. She called back in 40 minutes. Tony's going to say no, she said. I need you to understand that. He's going to say absolutely not. I don't do children. They're loud and sticky and they break things. I understand. And then, Pepper said, and Coulson could hear the very specific texture of her smile. I'm going to show him the energy readings. And then I'm going to show him the part about the letters from the magic school because Tony cannot resist a mystery. Phil, I want you to know that about him. It is both his greatest strength and the reason I need 3 glasses of wine on Fridays. And then I'm going to show him the photograph. The hospital had taken a photograph for the file. Harry sitting on the edge of the bed, small, serious, with his cracked glasses and his oversized shirt and his green eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and succeeding only in looking like someone who had been practicing neutral for so long he'd forgotten what the alternative felt like. Give me until noon, Pepper said. She called back at 11:15. He said yes, she said. He also said, and I'm quoting directly, I'm not calling him son, that's a whole thing, we're going to let him decide what he wants to be called. And also Pepper, if this kid blows up my lab, I'm going to be very upset. Coulson allowed himself a very small smile. I'll bring him this afternoon. Harry had never been in a car like this before. He'd been in Coulson's car, which was a black government issue thing that smelled like coffee and paperwork. This was different. The car that met them at the tower's private entrance was low and silver and made almost no sound. And the inside was all clean leather and soft lighting. And Harry sat in the back seat very carefully with his hands in his lap and his single bag between his feet. A hospital bag, white plastic, containing his cracked glasses, a library book that had been in his school bag when the house fell, and the electrical tape from the bridge of his glasses that he'd taken off when they'd given him a new pair. And tried not to touch anything, The tower was enormous. He'd seen it from the car, a gleaming finger pointed at the sky with the name Stark running down it in letters taller than his school, and he'd looked at it the way he'd learned to look at things that were too big to process, one piece at a time. The lobby was marble and glass. A man in a security uniform smiled at him, actually smiled, not the tight professional expression he'd been getting from S.H.I.E.L.D. people all day, but a real one, and said, "Welcome, Mr. Potter," and Harry didn't know what to do with that, so he just said thank you and followed Coulson to the elevator. The elevator had no buttons. It just knew apparently where you were going and took you there, and Harry stood in the middle of it trying not to stare at his own reflection in the polished doors and failing. "Friday," Coulson said to the ceiling. "Can you let Mr. Stark know we're on our way up?" "Already done, Agent Coulson," said a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. It was female and pleasant and had a slight lilt to it, and Harry's head snapped up. "Who's that?" he asked. "That's Friday," Coulson said. I'm an artificial intelligence," Friday said, with what might have been a thread of amusement in her voice. "I manage the building's systems. It's nice to meet you, Harry." Harry looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he said, "How do you know my name?" "Mr. Stark briefed me." "Is he—" Harry stopped, started again. "What's he like?" Friday's pause was almost imperceptible. "Honest answer or diplomatic answer?" Harry blinked. "Honest." "He's brilliant, frequently exhausting, occasionally infuriating, and he hasn't slept in 31 hours because he's been reading your file and the S.H.I.E.L.D. energy data, and he's built 3 different theoretical models for what you might be capable of. A beat. He also burned his dinner 3 times because he kept forgetting he was cooking." The elevator opened. Tony Stark was standing in the middle of the most extraordinary room Harry had ever seen, which was saying something given that Harry had been in a S.H.I.E.L.D. facility that morning. The space was open and vast, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city, the skyline laid out like a map of somewhere impossible. There were workbenches along one wall covered in pieces of things Harry couldn't name. There were holographic displays casting blue light across the floor. There was a couch that looked like it cost more than the Dursleys' entire house, and on the couch was a pepper-haired woman in a blue blazer who was watching him with an expression he also couldn't name, but that felt warm. Tony Stark himself was wearing a t-shirt with a black hole diagram on it and jeans with what looked like acetylene burns on the knee. And he had the particular look of a person who had been moving very fast all day, and had just now stopped because something made him stop. He was looking at Harry with an expression that wasn't pity. Harry had learned to recognize pity very quickly and to dislike it immediately, and wasn't the careful professional concern of the S.H.I.E.L.D. people. It was something more direct than that, something that was doing the math. "So," Tony said, "you're the kid who took out a load-bearing wall with his feelings." Beside him, Pepper made a very quiet sound. "I didn't mean to," Harry said, which was what he always said. "Yeah, I know," Tony said. "I've got the energy readings. Output equivalent to a small explosive detonation, radial blast pattern, structural damage selective enough that you were sitting on a piece of wall that had absolutely no physical reason to still be standing." He tilted his head. "How?" Harry stared at him. Every adult who'd asked him about what happened had asked it like they were filling in a form or like they expected him to lie. Tony Stark asked it like it was a puzzle. "I don't know," Harry said. But it came out differently than it usually did because it was the truth, not the practiced answer. I was scared, and then I wasn't anymore, and then the house was like that." Tony nodded slowly, like that tracked, like it was data that fit somewhere in a model he was building. "I'm going to need you to do me a favor," Tony said. Harry waited. "I need you to never say I don't know when what you mean is I don't know yet," Tony said, "because those are 2 completely different statements, and I've made a lot of money on the difference." He crossed the room, not quickly, not making it a big moment, just walking, and crouched down to Harry's eye level. Up close, his eyes were dark and very sharp and very tired, and there was a faint blue glow visible at the center of his chest through the t-shirt that Harry looked at and then politely looked away from. "You and I are going to figure out what you can do. Is that all right with you?" Harry looked at him. He'd been looked at plenty today. Assessed, cataloged, handled with professional care. This was the first time all day someone had asked him if something was all right with him. "Yes," Harry said. Tony straightened up. "Great. Friday, add a standard junior access card for the workshop to the new resident package." He glanced at Pepper. "You got the room set up." "An hour ago," Pepper said serenely. "Good, Harry, this is Pepper. She runs basically everything, including me on a good day." He was already moving back toward the workbench. "You hungry? The last 2 dinners I cooked were garbage, but there's a Thai place that delivers in about 20 minutes. Yes," Harry said, because the orange juice at the hospital had been the only thing he'd eaten, and it was nearly 6 in the evening. Then, because he couldn't stop himself, "You have a light in your chest." Tony paused at the workbench. He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, there was something in his face that was too complex to unpack in a glance. "I do," he said. "Does it hurt?" Another pause. "Not anymore," Tony said. Harry nodded like that was an answer that made sense to him, because in some deep, wordless way, it did. The room they'd prepared for him was on the 14th floor, which Tony had explained was residential, not lab, the difference being that one of those spaces is appropriate for sleeping in, and I'll let you figure out which. It was bigger than any room Harry had ever been in. There was a proper bed, not a cot, not a fold-out, a real bed with a dark blue duvet and 3 pillows, which felt obscene. There was a desk with a new laptop on it still in its box. There was a window that looked out over the east side of the city, and if you pressed your face to the glass, you could see a slice of the river going silver in the evening light. Harry stood in the middle of it for a long time. He kept expecting someone to come in and say there'd been a mistake, that the room was for someone else, that he should go back to the small one. The cupboard under the stairs at Privet Drive had been his room for the first 5 years of his life, and when he'd been moved to Dudley's second bedroom, it had felt enormous and wrong, and he'd kept waiting to be moved back. Nobody came. After a while, he sat on the edge of the bed very carefully and put his hands on the duvet, and the duvet was soft in a way that felt almost ridiculous, and he stared at the far wall. His stomach hurt. Not from hunger, they'd eaten the Thai food, all 3 of them at a kitchen island, while Tony argued with Friday about the theoretical maximum magical output that a prepubescent human could achieve, which Harry had found simultaneously bizarre and oddly comforting. His stomach hurt in the way it hurt sometimes when something happened that he didn't have words for. He'd heard Tony on the phone when he thought Harry was out of earshot. Standing in the corridor outside the kitchen, voice low but not low enough. "Phil, I'm not doing this for optics. I read the file. I know what those bruises mean. If you think I'm going to no, Fury can take his strategic placement, and yes, I'm keeping him. That's not Coulson. I'm not having this argument with you." Then a long pause. "Look, I know I'm not. I know what I am, okay. I know I'm a disaster, and I'm not exactly a shining example of look. He blew up a house with his feelings, and nobody taught him how. Okay, that's a problem I know how to solve. Just let me try." Harry had stood in the corridor for a moment after the call ended, then quietly gone back to the kitchen and eaten the rest of his pad thai. He didn't know yet what to do with it. The information that someone had argued on his behalf. He tucked it somewhere small and warm and didn't look at it directly, the way he didn't look directly at the sun. He reached into his hospital bag, now sitting on the desk, looking very small and white against the polished wood, and took out the library book. It was a battered copy of The Hobbit, borrowed 3 weeks ago and technically now overdue, and he'd read it twice already, but he liked it in the particular way he liked things that felt like a door left open. He lay back on the enormous bed with its ridiculous pillows and opened it to the first page. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Outside the window, New York glittered and hummed, enormous and indifferent and alive. Harry read until midnight, which was something he had never in his life been allowed to do, and then he fell asleep with the book open on his chest and his glasses on and all the lights still on, because there was no one to tell him to turn them off. Friday dimmed them to 30% at 1 a.m. and told nobody. He woke to someone knocking on the door. Not pounding, not the sharp, angry rap he was used to, but actual knocking, 2 knuckles, patient. "Yeah," he said, sitting up fast, disoriented by the size of the room. The door opened. It was a woman he hadn't met yet, dark red hair pulled back, a coffee mug in each hand, wearing a black running top with the ease of someone who'd been up for an hour. She looked at him with dark eyes that were doing several things at once, cataloging and assessing, and somewhere underneath that, something gentler that she was keeping very far down. "You're Natasha," Harry said. He'd seen her in the shield file Coulson had left out on the car ride over. He hadn't been sure he was meant to see it, but it had been there and he'd read quickly. She didn't look surprised that he'd named her. She handed him one of the mugs, hot chocolate, he discovered when he looked in it, and leaned against the doorframe. "Tony said you were sharp," she said. "How'd you know?" "Your picture was in the file," Harry said. "Also, you move like you know where everything in a room is before you walk into it." Natasha looked at him for a moment that stretched slightly longer than most moments. Then she said, "Good morning, Harry." And it was the first time anyone had said that to him in the same breath as his actual name, and he didn't know what to do with that either. "Good morning," he said. She pushed off the doorframe. "Breakfast in 20. Tony cooks on Tuesdays, which is a complicated experience, so I'd come down before he sets anything on fire." She started to leave, then paused. The library book, Tolkien. Harry looked down at the Hobbit, still lying on the bed. "Yeah. The sequel's better," Natasha said. "I'll find you a copy." She was gone before he could answer, and Harry sat in his enormous room with his hot chocolate and his borrowed book and the city going gold outside the window, and thought that this was very strange, and thought that strange might be all right. The first time his magic manifested in the tower, he'd been there 4 days. It was small, a mug sliding off the edge of the kitchen counter and Harry's hand shooting out, and the mug stopping in midair 6 inches above the floor. He caught it with his fingers half a second later, his heart pounding, and turned around slowly to find Tony standing in the kitchen doorway holding a wrench and watching. He waited for the shout. "This is what you've done, you're unnatural, the specific quality of silence that meant get to your cupboard." Tony walked to the coffee maker, poured himself a mug, and said without looking up, "Reaction time was good, control was good, it looked like you grabbed the air and told it to hold something, which is fascinating from a physics standpoint." He finally looked at Harry. "Does it feel like grabbing?" Harry blinked. "Sort of," he said slowly. "It's more like knowing where things are and deciding." Tony took a long sip of coffee, looked at the mug still in Harry's hand. "Do it again, intentionally this time. I want to measure the field distribution." "You want me to?" "Levitate the mug, yes, we're doing science. Friday, get the field sensors running in the kitchen." Harry looked at the mug. He thought about what he'd told Tony that first evening. "I was scared, and then I wasn't, and then the house was like that." He put the mug back on the counter. He looked at it. He thought up. The mug rose smoothly to about shoulder height and stopped, rotating very slowly. Tony stared at it. Then he stared at Harry. "Friday," he said. "Ambient field reading is extraordinary, boss," Friday said. "No electromagnetic basis, no thermal signature. I'm registering something in a frequency range that doesn't have a name yet." "Great," Tony said very quietly. "We're going to need to name a frequency range." He put down his coffee, pulled a stool out from under the kitchen island, and sat down with his full attention pointed at Harry like a beam. "Okay, tell me everything you know about how this works." "Almost nothing," Harry said honestly. Tony's expression was the happiest Harry had seen it. "Even better," he said. "That means we get to find out together." The mug continued to rotate quietly in the air between them. And outside the tower windows, the city was already loud and ordinary and alive. And somewhere in the building, Natasha was running on a treadmill and Bruce Banner was making tea, and Friday was adding a new field to her sensor catalog that she tentatively labeled Magical Energy HP. And something was beginning quietly, without announcement, without anyone knowing yet what it would become. Something was beginning that felt, for the first time in Harry's life, like it was his. Chapter 2, Assembly. The first thing Thor did when he met Harry was sit down on the floor, not in a dramatic way. Not in the careful, this is how you approach small children way that some of the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents had done, crouching with their hands visible, voices pitched low like Harry was a spooked animal. Thor simply walked into the common room on a Wednesday afternoon 4 months after Harry had moved in, saw Harry cross-legged on the carpet with a disassembled Stark pad spread in pieces around him and a screwdriver in his teeth, and folded himself down onto the floor 6 feet away with the ease of someone who'd sat on far worse surfaces in far more dangerous situations. He put his hammer down beside him. He picked up one of the Stark pad pieces and looked at it. "What does this piece do?" he asked. Harry took the screwdriver out of his teeth. "Haptic feedback array," he said. "Tony said I could take it apart if I could put it back together. I've done it twice. This is the 3rd time." "Why a 3rd time?" "Because the 2nd time I put it back together it worked, but there was a piece left over and I want to know where it goes." Thor looked at the piece in his hand. Then he looked at Harry with eyes that were very blue and very old in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with having seen a great deal. "I like that," he said. "On Asgard, we say that a warrior who leaves a battlefield without accounting for every weapon is not yet finished." Harry thought about that. "It's a capacitor," he said. "I think it goes between the haptic layer and the battery connector, but Tony routed the power draw differently than I expected." Thor set the capacitor down between them. "And your father, Tony, he knows you're doing this. He's the one who took the back off," Harry said. "He said the best way to learn a system is to kill it and bring it back." Thor smiled. It transformed his whole face, which was already a lot of face to begin with. "He and I disagree on many things," he said, "but on that we are in accord." That was how it started, the particular friendship between Harry Potter and Thor Odinson, which would go on to confuse and occasionally alarm the rest of the Avengers for the next 12 years. It started on a Wednesday on the floor of the common room, with a disassembled Stark pad and a spare capacitor, and by the time Harry had found where it went, wedged between the battery connector and a secondary ground, which was where Tony had hidden it deliberately, he discovered later, because Tony thought making problems slightly harder than they needed to be built character. Thor had told him 3 stories about Asgard and Harry had asked 27 follow-up questions. "You use magic," Harry said when Thor paused. "Tony says what I do is probably magic. Is it the same?" Thor tilted his head, considering this with the seriousness Harry was already learning to appreciate in him. "Your magic and Sather, the craft of Asgard, are not identical," he said slowly. "But they are perhaps cousin. Both are tied to will, both respond to emotion, both are part of the fabric of the universe, not separate from it." He paused. "What does it feel like when you use it?" Harry looked at the reassembled Stark pad in his hands. Like, he started, then he tried again. Like something is always there, just underneath everything, like water under ice, and when I really need it or when I'm really scared or angry, the ice gets thin and it comes through. Except I can't control when the ice is thin. Thor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if the ice is not ice? What if it is a door?" Harry looked at him. "Ice implies that warmth is the enemy," Thor said, "that you must be in distress for it to work. But if it is a door, then it opens when you choose. And a door can be learned." He looked at Mjolnir sitting beside him, and something complicated moved through his expression. "I did not always know how to call the storm. I had to learn to be worthy of it. Worthiness is not a state you achieve. It is a choice you make again and again." Harry stared at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you teach me the door thing?" Thor looked at him and then he smiled again, and this time it was a different kind of smile, slower and more certain. "Yes," he said, "I think I can." Thor's lessons happened on the roof. Not because the roof was mystically significant, but because the first time Harry had tried to open the door on purpose, standing in the kitchen, Thor watching, attempting to slide a glass across the counter without touching it, he'd gotten excited and the window above the sink had exploded outward. Tony, who had been 3 feet away, had stood absolutely still for 1 second, then turned around and said, "Roof, both of you, go. I just had those windows replaced," with the energy of a man who was 3 seconds from an aneurysm and had decided to channel it into logistics. The roof was Tony's original exclusion zone for anything involving uncontrolled energy output, which meant it had already been reinforced with a dampening system he'd built after a training session with Natasha had gotten out of hand in a way no one discussed in detail. It had open sky above it and a direct sightline to the street below and absolutely nothing breakable on it, which made it, as Tony told Friday while watching from a camera feed with Bruce, ideal for whatever this is. "What is this?" Bruce asked, beside him watching the feed. On screen, Harry stood on the roof with his arms out slightly, eyes closed. Thor sat on the parapet 20 feet away with the air of someone attending a lecture he was enjoying. A pebble on the rooftop surface vibrated, lifted, traveled in a slow arc and settled back down. "It's the most controlled voluntary manifestation I've recorded from him," Tony said. "Yesterday he moved a pen 3 inches. Today he just moved a pebble 8 feet. He pulled up a data overlay on the feed. The energy output is completely different from the involuntary stuff. More refined, lower ambient footprint, more intentional. He's learning to direct it," Bruce said. "He's learning to think of it as a skill instead of a symptom," Tony said, and there was something in his voice that sounded less like scientific analysis and more like a man recognizing something in someone else. "That's harder than it sounds." Below them on the screen, the pebble lifted again. Then a second pebble lifted. Then both of them drifted together in a slow circle, and Harry opened his eyes and watched them go. And even on a grainy security feed, the expression on his face was unmistakable. Pure, clean, uncomplicated delight. Tony turned away from the screen and picked up his coffee and didn't say anything. Bruce watched him for a moment, then looked back at the feed. "He likes you," Bruce said mildly. "He likes the workshop," Tony said. "He saved you a piece of his pad thai last night." "He was being polite, Tony," Bruce said. "I'm going back to work," Tony said, and walked away from the camera feed, and Bruce smiled at the screen where Harry's 2 pebbles were now spiraling in opposite directions while Thor applauded. By the time Harry was 8.5, Friday had a dedicated sensor array for his magical output. By the time he was 9, Tony had a working theoretical model for how it interacted with electromagnetic fields, which Bruce had reviewed and annotated, and Natasha had read with an expression of perfect blankness that Tony had learned to recognize as fascinated. By the time he was 9.5, Harry could move objects up to about 12 kilograms without visible effort, had manifested a shield twice under controlled conditions, and had accidentally lit 3 things on fire, which Tony had responded to by installing fire suppression more comprehensively throughout the residential floors and saying nothing more about it. The fire thing had been more interesting than alarming. Harry had been angry, genuinely angry, which was rare, because he tended to go very quiet rather than loud when upset, about something Dudley Dursley had said in a phone call that Child Services had, for some incomprehensible procedural reason, facilitated. He'd been in his room after, sitting on his bed. The curtains at his window had caught, not dramatically, not roaringly, just a small lick of flame at the hem, and Harry had looked at it and taken a breath and it had gone out. He told Tony about it the next day matter-of-factly, because he'd learned quickly that Tony's reaction to revelations about his capabilities was to get excited and start building models, which was considerably preferable to the alternatives. What he hadn't told Tony, what he hadn't told anyone, was that in the second before he'd put the flame out, he'd looked at it and it had felt good, not the fire itself. the control. The knowing that it had come from him and that he could stop it and that it wasn't an accident, it was a choice. He sat with that for a week, examining it the way Tony had taught him to examine things he didn't understand, systematically, without judgment, looking for the mechanism before the meaning. The mechanism, he eventually decided, was simple. The magic had been there all his life, doing things to him without his permission. Mostly bad things or frightening things or things that got him in trouble. And for the first time, it had done something he'd wanted, in a direction he'd chosen, with a force he'd controlled. He wasn't angry about what Dudley had said anymore. He was just interested. Natasha taught him differently than Thor did. Thor taught him with stories and metaphors and a quality of patient attention that felt like being taken seriously by a mountain. Natasha taught him by doing things in front of him and saying nothing and waiting for him to figure out why. He'd been 9 when she'd started. She'd come to the common room one morning when he was reading, sat down on the floor between the coffee table and the couch, and begun moving through what he would later learn was a modified version of a Russian intelligence assessment exercise. A slow, deliberate arrangement and rearrangement of objects on the coffee table, seemingly random. He'd watched over the top of his book for about 3 minutes before he'd put the book down. "There are 14 objects," he said. "You've moved the same 3 twice. The order you're putting them in, it's not random. The heavier things are on the left and the lighter things are on the right, but not by weight, by center of gravity." Natasha looked at him. "Why does center of gravity matter?" "If someone comes through that door," Harry said slowly, working it out as he spoke, "and you need to throw something at them, you want to know without looking which things will fly straight and which will tumble." She picked up a small stapler from the table and tossed it to him without warning. He caught it. "Now you know which hand I favor," she said. He stared at her. "You threw it to my right on purpose. What else did you learn?" He turned the stapler over. "You weren't worried I'd drop it, so you've been watching how I catch things before." A pause. "How long?" "Since you got here," she said pleasantly. He looked at her with his green eyes and his expression that had been slowly, over 2 years, learning to do more things than just neutral. "Are you teaching me?" he asked. "I'm talking to you," she said. "That's the same thing with you." The corner of her mouth moved. "Move the objects so that you could use them and I couldn't." He looked at the coffee table. He looked at her hands and her position on the floor and the distance to the door and the angle of the morning light from the window. He rearranged the objects. She looked at the result. "Good," she said, which was the first time she'd used that word with him, "and he filed it in the same small warm place as I argued on your behalf, and I'll find you a copy," and found that the collection was getting bigger slowly, like a room he was gradually furnishing. Steve he learned from without meaning to, which was probably the point. Steve Rogers had a quality that Harry had noticed and not been able to name for a long time. And then one afternoon when he was 10 and they were sparring, not seriously, Steve had introduced the concept of light contact sparring as just a thing I do in the mornings if anyone wants to join, with studied casualness. And Harry had started showing up because the mornings were long and the movement felt good. Harry got knocked flat on his back. Hard enough that the breath left his body and the ceiling spun. He lay there for a second. "You all right?" Steve asked, hand extended. Harry took the hand, let himself be hauled up, and immediately moved his weight differently, left foot back, and watched the way Steve's shoulders shifted to compensate. "You pulled that," Harry said. "A little," Steve admitted. "Don't." Steve looked at him. Harry looked back, chin level, breathing returned to normal. "You're 10, Steve said. "You were 90 pounds at 17 and you kept getting up," Harry said. "Friday told me." Steve's mouth twitched. "Friday tells you a lot of things. She likes me." "She likes everyone." He settled back into his stance. "All right from the top and I won't pull it." He didn't, and Harry got knocked down 4 more times and got up 4 more times. And on the 5th exchange he got inside Steve's guard by doing something that wasn't quite a feint and wasn't quite a redirection. It was something between them that used the magic not as a weapon but as an extension of his instincts. A half-second of knowing where Steve's weight was going before Steve knew, and he touched 2 fingers to Steve's sternum and stepped back. They both went very still. "Do that again," Steve said quietly. "I don't know if I can," Harry said honestly. "It just happened." "Okay," Steve said. "Then we do it 100 times until it happens again, and then we figure out what you did." He put his hands down. From the top. That was the quality Harry had been trying to name. Steve Rogers never stopped. Not with discouragement, not with frustration, not with the particular quiet fury that Harry had always associated with authority figures telling him he was too much or too little or too difficult or too strange. Steve just reset to the beginning and kept going with a steadiness that wasn't stubbornness but something deeper, a fundamental conviction that the point was not to succeed, the point was to not quit, and that those two things were not the same. Harry thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about how different it was from the first 7 years of his life, when getting knocked down meant staying down because getting up meant getting knocked down harder. He thought about what it felt like in his chest to have someone next to him who expected him to get up, who stood there with their hand out and just waited. He thought it might be the most important thing anyone had ever taught him, and nobody had used a single word to teach it. Bruce Banner taught him with actual words, in a lab with a whiteboard. This was different from Tony's teaching, which happened in motion in the middle of building things, half explanation and half challenge, and entirely exhilarating. Bruce sat him down at a proper chair at a proper workbench and said, "We're going to talk about physics." And Harry said, "Okay." And Bruce said, "Not Newtonian physics. Not yet. We're going to start with the question of what the universe is actually made of and work forward from there." Harry had been 9.5 and had been in the middle of a heated argument with Tony about the most efficient way to reroute power in a gauntlet prototype. Not a real one, a model, plastic and copper wire and an arc reactor junior that Tony had built for the express purpose of letting Harry take it apart. And he'd been willing to pause that argument for Bruce's whiteboard because Bruce's whiteboard sessions had a way of ending with the argument you'd been having beforehand suddenly making complete sense. "Okay," Harry said, "what is it made of?" That, Bruce said, uncapping his marker, is genuinely one of the most contested questions in modern physics, and anyone who tells you they're completely sure is trying to sell you something. He wrote energy equals matter on the board. What we know is that what we think of as solid, physical, real things, this table, that coffee cup, you, are mostly empty space and probability. Harry looked at the table. That doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem right because you're running a very good macro-scale simulation, Bruce said, not unkindly. Your brain and your senses are built to interact with the world at the scale of objects and forces. They are not built to perceive the scale at which the table is mostly nothing. He tapped the board. But magic, what you do, seems to operate at a scale somewhere between those two things. It doesn't obey Newtonian mechanics. It doesn't operate at the quantum scale either, based on Tony's readings. It's something in between. Harry stared at the board. So it's in the space where physics hasn't caught up yet. Bruce paused, marker in hand. That, he said, is actually a very good way to put it. Tony says the energy I produce doesn't have a name in the spectrum. That's correct. So when I move something without touching it, Harry said slowly, I'm not breaking physics. I'm using a part of physics that hasn't been written down yet. Bruce looked at him with an expression that was one of the best things Harry had seen in his 10 years, which was the expression of someone encountering an idea they hadn't thought of in quite that way before. Yes, he said. Yes, Harry, that is exactly what you're doing. He turned back to the board and started writing. Now, if that's the case, then in theory, and I want to emphasize in theory, Tony will not let me emphasize in theory enough when he gets his teeth into a problem, it means your magic can potentially be described with a framework. Measured, modeled, and if it can be modeled, it can be engineered, Harry said. Bruce turned around. Harry was looking at the whiteboard with an expression that at 10 years old had no business being as focused as it was. That's what Tony's been thinking, he said. The gauntlet. He didn't say it was for me, but it's the right size for my hand, and he keeps asking me questions about how the output feels when I'm trying to be precise versus when I'm trying to be powerful, like he's calibrating something. He looked at Bruce. He's trying to build something that interfaces with the magic. Bruce was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to tell you whether that's right, he said, which told Harry everything. What I'm going to tell you is that if someone were building such a thing, the most important question they'd need answered would be about the interface layer, the point where technology and magic actually communicate with each other. He capped his marker. So the question I'd want that person to spend some time thinking about is, what does your magic talk to? What does it actually interact with physically, energetically when it does something? Harry sat very still, thinking. Me, he said finally. It talks to me, it doesn't go out and do things, it does what I mean. Not what I say, not what I consciously think, what I mean. Bruce nodded slowly. So the interface layer, Harry said, working it out, isn't in the machine, it's in me. The machine just has to listen. He looked up and found Bruce smiling at him with a warmth that had nothing performative about it, that was just a person being genuinely delighted by a 10-year-old working something out in real time. Don't tell Tony I told you, Bruce said. Told me what? Harry said. He turned 11 on July 31st. Tony made a cake. This was objectively a disaster. Tony's relationship with cooking was one of intense theoretical understanding and catastrophically poor execution, and the cake looked like something had gone wrong with the structural integrity, and the icing was applied with the confidence of an engineer who had decided that more was more. It was lopsided. It was also chocolate, which Harry had mentioned once 2 months ago, in passing, that he liked, which meant Tony had remembered and bought the right ingredients and made the attempt, and Harry looked at the lopsided chocolate disaster of a cake and felt something crack open in his chest in a way he didn't have a word for yet. They ate it in the common room, all of them, Tony and Pepper, Natasha, Steve, Bruce, Thor, who had arrived that morning from Asgard with a gift that turned out to be a small carved stone that, when held in your left hand, made you faintly perceive the emotional state of anyone in the room, which Thor explained was a training tool for young Asgardian students of Sather. Harry had held it for 30 seconds and put it down very carefully. Too much, Thor asked. It's a lot, Harry said. There's a lot in there. Yes, Thor said gently. That is why it is a training tool, to teach young ones to receive much input and choose what to act upon. He looked at Harry steadily. You are not obligated to use it, but you might find it illuminating. Harry had looked at the stone, then he picked it back up. He kept it. Steve's gift was a compass that had been his grandfather's, which Harry understood without being told was significant beyond its material value, and he handled it accordingly. Natasha gave him the Lord of the Rings box set in Russian, which she then looked at and said also this, and handed him a folding knife that had a blade length technically within civilian legal limits and which she'd taught him to use safely over the past 2 years. Pepper gave him a proper set of drafting tools and a leather-bound notebook that she said was for plans, not homework. Homework can go in a regular notebook. Bruce gave him a textbook on quantum field theory with a post-it note on the cover that said you'll be bored by chapter 4. I was 2, skipped to chapter 9, and Harry laughed for the first time that day at that, properly laughed. And Tony gave him the gauntlet, not the finished one. Not yet. A framework titanium alloy, lightweight, designed to fit his right hand, threaded throughout with filaments so fine they were nearly invisible. Each one coated with a compound that Tony and Bruce had spent 6 months developing specifically for the purpose of conducting and amplifying magical energy output. There was a small arc reactor housing built into the palm with a junior element installed, not for power but for calibration, as a kind of baseline signal the magic could push against. It looked precise and purposeful and extraordinary and absolutely nothing like a birthday present. It looked like a piece of equipment, which meant Tony had understood exactly what Harry would want. Harry held it in both hands and turned it over very slowly. It won't do anything yet, Tony said. He was sitting on the arm of the couch trying to look casual, which was not a thing Tony Stark could do under any circumstances. It's a prototype. The filament conductivity is theoretical. We haven't tested whether the interface layer concept actually. Can I try it? Harry asked. Tony opened his mouth, closed it. It's not ready, Tony, Harry said very patiently, and Tony stopped because Harry only used that particular patience on him when he was being an idiot about something. Harry put the gauntlet on. The room went very quiet. He flexed his fingers. The filaments caught the light. He could feel them, not physically, not exactly, but in the same sense that he could feel the space between objects when he was reaching for them with the magic. There was a new texture to it, like the gauntlet had given the magic something to hold on to. He held his hand out, palm up. A small flame appeared above his palm, steady, clean, about the size of a candle flame, not wild, not dangerous, controlled like turning on a lamp. The filaments pulsed once with a faint blue light, reading the output, and the flame brightened slightly and stayed precisely where it was. It lasted for about 10 seconds. He closed his hand and it was gone. The room breathed. Okay, Tony said, and his voice was doing something that it only did when he was trying very hard not to do anything visible with his face. Okay, the connectivity works. The interface layer is... He stopped. Bruce, are you seeing? I see it, Bruce said quietly. Harry took the gauntlet off carefully and set it in his lap and looked at it. Happy birthday, Tony said. Harry looked up at him. Thanks, Dad, he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things came out when the door was open, simply, without calculation, from the part of him that had been deciding things slowly over 4 years and had just reached a conclusion. Tony's face did many things very rapidly. Harry watched all of them. And then Tony said very quietly, yeah, and looked at the ceiling briefly, and nodded once like he was confirming something to himself, and then said, right, who wants more cake because that thing is not going to eat itself and I made too much. And Natasha immediately said she wanted more, and Steve said he could probably manage another piece, and the moment passed into the general noise of the room. But later, when they were cleaning up, Harry saw Tony standing at the kitchen counter with his back to the room, and his shoulders were doing something that weren't quite shaking. And he stayed there for about 30 seconds and then turned around and picked up a stack of plates and carried them to the dishwasher, and his face was completely normal. Harry took the gauntlet to his room and put it on his desk and lay on his bed and looked at the ceiling with the carved Asgardian stone in his left hand, and the stone was warm, and it said in the wordless language that feelings have that everyone in the rooms below him was happy. All of them. Genuinely, simply happy. He pressed the stone against his chest and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The Hogwarts letter arrived on a Monday morning in late July, 3 weeks before his 11th birthday, which was technically a re-arrival since S.H.I.E.L.D. had the previous collection, but this one was different. This one was brought by an owl that appeared at the kitchen window at 6 a.m. and sat there with the patience of a civil servant waiting to be acknowledged. Harry had been the only one in the kitchen. He'd opened the window. The owl had deposited the letter on the counter and immediately helped itself to his toast, which he felt was audacious and sort of admirable. He'd read the letter. Then he made himself a cup of tea, which was something he'd learned to do properly because Bruce drank a lot of tea and it had seemed important to be able to make it well. He'd sat at the kitchen island with the letter in front of him and his tea and thought about it for about 20 minutes. Then Tony had walked in. "There's an owl eating your toast," Tony said. "I know," Harry said. "It brought a letter." Tony looked at the owl, looked at the letter, sat down across from Harry. "Read it without touching it." Then he said, "So, Hogwarts, yeah, you want to go." It wasn't a question, but Harry treated it like one. "I've been thinking about it since I found out about it," he said. "It's where I'm from in a way. The magic, whatever I am, there's a whole world of people like me and I've never met any of them." "I know, and the things I could learn there, I know," Tony said again. But Harry said. Tony waited. "The letters," Harry said carefully. "The ones S.H.I.E.L.D. found. Someone's been tracking me since I was a baby. Someone put me with the Dursleys. And the letters, they weren't just notifications, they were, whoever wrote them knew I was there, knew the address. Which means they knew what was happening there and didn't do anything about it." His voice was level. "I want to know who that is before I walk into their school." Tony was quiet for a moment, and in his silence Harry could see him recalibrating, the way he always did when Harry said something that advanced the conversation past where Tony had been expecting it to go. "His name is Albus Dumbledore," Tony said. "Fury's had a file on him for 3 years. He's the headmaster of Hogwarts. He's arguably the most powerful wizard alive, and his interest in you goes back further than the letters." A pause. "You were left with the Dursleys on his direction." Harry's expression didn't change in any dramatic way. His jaw set very slightly. "Why?" "He thinks you're meant to fight someone," Tony said with the directness that Harry had come to understand was his form of respect. "Someone named Voldemort. He thinks the reason you survived as a baby is because your mother's, there was a magical protection involved. And he thinks the most important thing he can do is make sure you're positioned correctly to confront that when the time comes." "Positioned," Harry repeated. His word, in his correspondence with Fury. Tony watched him. "He's not wrong about the threat. Voldemort is real. Fury's got data on what happened when he was active in Britain in the 70s and 80s. It was bad. But you're a person, not a chess piece, and he's been treating those two things as if they're negotiable." Tony's voice was flat. "I have opinions about that." Harry looked at the Hogwarts letter. He looked at the owl, which had finished his toast and was now examining the toaster with professional interest. He picked the letter up. "I want to go," he said. "I want to learn everything they can teach me. And I want Dumbledore to understand from the first day I walk into that school that I know exactly what he's been doing and that I'm there on my own terms." Tony looked at him. Harry was 10 years old and sitting in their kitchen in bare feet with his hair like a hedgehog and his Stark Industries Science Camp t-shirt. And Tony looked at him and thought, "I have not once in my life done anything that deserved this kid, and I am going to spend the rest of it making sure he has everything he needs to be exactly this." "The gauntlet's going with you," Tony said. "We'll have it at Mark II by September, and you're keeping your earpiece." "I know," Harry said. "And you're calling if anything," Harry said. "Anything at all, Harry. I don't care what time it is, Tony." Harry met his eyes. "I know." The owl knocked the toaster off the counter. They both looked at it. The owl looked back. "Get that thing off my counter," Tony said, which was as close to "I love you too" as he was usually able to get before 8 a.m. And Harry picked up the owl and carried it to the window and let it go and watched it become a dark speck against the morning sky heading north. They had 4 weeks. Tony and Harry spent most of them in the workshop. The Mark II gauntlet was lighter than the first, the filament array 3 times denser, the arc reactor housing redesigned with a rotational energy distributor that Bruce had proposed and Harry had modified twice. It fit his right hand like it had grown there. The calibration sessions were daily, systematic, and occasionally resulted in things getting dented or scorched, which Tony documented photographically with the enthusiasm of someone who did not have to file the insurance paperwork. Natasha spent 2 of those 4 weeks teaching Harry things she described only as Hogwarts-specific awareness skills, and which included reading a room the moment you entered it, identifying exits before you identified threats, and a specific technique for holding a conversation while simultaneously tracking a second conversation happening elsewhere in the room, which she said was common sense in any institution with a political power structure, and Hogwarts very obviously has one. Steve gave him a compass of his own, a modern one but small and solid, because Steve Rogers believed in always knowing which direction was north. Thor came for the last weekend before September and they went up to the roof and sat in the dark after the sun went down. The city spread below them and Thor talked about the first time he left Asgard. not the exile before that. The first time he'd gone somewhere new as himself, not as a prince, just as someone learning what he was. Were you afraid? Harry asked. Immensely, Thor said, and also not at all, both at once. Because I knew what I was afraid of, the strangeness, the unknown, the possibility of failure, and I knew what I was not afraid of myself. He looked at Harry in the dark. Whatever Hogwarts holds for you, whatever challenges, whatever people with agendas for who you should be, you know yourself. You have been learning yourself for 4 years in the company of people who would never let you be less than what you are. He paused. That is not something they can take from you. Harry looked at the city. I'm not afraid of Hogwarts, he said. No, Thor agreed. I know. I'm a bit excited about the magic, Harry admitted. Thor laughed, and it was the big laugh, the one that rolled around the rooftop and went out over the city. And Harry grinned because Thor's laugh was one of those things in the world that it was physically impossible not to grin at. That, Thor said, is the correct response. The morning of September 1st, Harry stood in the entrance of Stark Tower with a trunk that Tony had custom built. Standard exterior, extraordinary interior, reinforced walls housing a secondary compartment with the gauntlet case and a secondary arc reactor and a set of tools and a month's worth of protein bars that Natasha had added without comment, and looked at the people assembled to see him off. Steve in civilian clothes, hands in his pockets, who nodded once when Harry met his eyes, and that nod contained everything Steve Rogers was capable of saying about pride and faith in a single movement. Bruce, holding his 4th cup of tea, who said Chapter 9, which made Harry smile. Natasha, who straightened the collar of his jacket with 2 fingers in a gesture so brief it was almost nothing, and said, call if you need extraction, in a voice that was completely serious, and Harry said, I won't need extraction, and she said, I know, but call anyway. Thor, who had arrived at 7 a.m. with what he said was a traditional Asgardian send-off blessing, and which mostly involved enthusiastic stories about legendary warriors going into new battles, and who hugged Harry with the careful, enormous force of someone who kept remembering at the last second to not crush people. Pepper, who had made certain he had his emergency contact card and his travel documents and 3 different phone numbers for 3 different Stark Industries legal representatives in the UK, and who pressed her cheek to his forehead briefly and said, we're a phone call away. All of us. All the time, in a voice that was steady and warm and entirely sure of itself. And Tony, who had been quiet all morning in the particular way that meant his brain was too full of things he wasn't saying, and who now looked at Harry with dark eyes that were doing the math one last time. The gauntlet is in the secondary compartment, Tony said. The arc element has 6 months of charge on the calibration circuit. Don't let anyone take it apart. If they break the filament array, the whole thing needs to be rebuilt from scratch. A pause. Friday has remote read access to the sensors, so I'll know if the output profile changes significantly. If it does, Harry said. I'll be all right, Harry said, and then because he knew Tony better than Tony knew himself by this point. And so will you. Tony's jaw moved. Get on the train, he said. Harry picked up his trunk, turned toward the car, then turned back. He crossed the space between them and hugged Tony Stark firmly, arms around him. And Tony made a small sound like a man being surprised by weather, and then hugged him back, and it lasted about 4 seconds, which was about 3 seconds longer than Tony would usually permit and exactly as long as it needed to be. Harry stepped back, picked up his trunk, walked to the car. He did not look back, because if he looked back he would not go, and he was going because he had things to find out. Behind him, he heard Tony say to no one in particular, Friday, if this school tries anything, I want full operational status on the already prepared boss, Friday said. Harry smiled, facing forward, and got in the car. Chapter 3. Arrival. The Hogwarts Express was older than anything Harry had ever touched. He could feel it the moment he stepped onto the platform at King's Cross, not platform 9 3/4 itself, which was just a platform, bricks and iron and the particular smell of old stations, but the train. The scarlet engine sat at the head of the carriages like something that had decided to be permanent, and when Harry walked past it on his way to find a compartment, he put his hand briefly on the side of it, just for a second, and felt the magic in it the way you felt heat from a fire that had been burning for a very long time. Old, patient, quietly pleased with itself. He found a compartment near the middle of the train and hoisted his trunk into the rack with the ease of someone who'd been training with Steve Rogers for 3 years, and sat down facing the window and watched the platform. There were families everywhere, children in robes clutching owls and toads and cats, parents with the particular expression of people trying to look composed, older students moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of people who knew where they were going. None of them looked at him, or rather, a few of them looked at him and then looked away, and Harry understood after a moment that they were looking at his forehead, the scar. He'd been warned about this by Coulson, who had said simply, "In the wizarding world, you are known, Harry. Prepare to be recognized," in the same tone you'd used to brief someone for a difficult terrain scenario. Harry had listened and filed it and thought, fine, people can know my name. That doesn't mean they know me. The compartment door slid open. A girl with brown bushy hair and a prefect's worth of determined efficiency looked in, took in the empty seats, and said, "Do you mind? Everywhere else is either full or there are boys throwing things." "Go ahead," Harry said. She sat down with her own trunk and immediately pulled a thick book from her bag with the ease of someone who did not consider that unusual behavior for a train journey. Harry watched her for a moment. She had the quality of someone whose brain was always going slightly faster than her mouth could keep up with, which was a quality he recognized. "I'm Hermione Granger," she said without looking up from the book. "First year, you're Harry Potter. That obvious." "The scar helps," she said, and then looked up very briefly with an expression that wasn't awe. It was assessment, quick and thorough, the same kind Natasha did. "Also, I've read about your family situation in a wizarding historical context, which isn't the same as knowing you, obviously, but you were described in Hogwarts, a history as well anyway." She went back to her book. "Sorry, I do that. What? Start talking and then realize I've said more than I intended." She turned a page. "I'm working on it." "You don't have to work on it on my account," Harry said. "What did Hogwarts, a history, say?" She looked up. He was watching her with something in his eyes that was genuinely interested, not politely interested. The distinction was one she was already good at making. That you were famous for surviving the killing curse as a baby. That you were raised by muggles. That you're expected to be, well, a lot of things, frankly. A pause. "What are you actually like?" Harry smiled. It was the particular smile that had developed over 4 years in Stark Tower, the one that was warm and real but also contained something measured, because Natasha had taught him that everything you showed was information, and information should be given deliberately. "Interested in everything," he said, bad at sitting still. "I live with scientists and superheroes, which probably tells you more than a biography would." Hermione's book lowered by approximately 3 inches. "You actually live with them, with the Avengers, since I was 7. Tony Stark is he adopted me, yeah." The book lowered fully. That's extraordinary from a cross-cultural, magical, technical interface standpoint alone, the potential implications for." She stopped herself. "Sorry, don't be," Harry said. "I've been thinking about the same thing for 2 years. Hermione Granger looked at him for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating very rapidly. Then she said, carefully, like she was testing the ground, "The theory that magic and quantum mechanics might be operating in overlapping frequency ranges rather than separate domains is one that my dad and Bruce Banner have been working models on since I was 9, Harry said. "What have you read about it?" The book went into her bag. She turned in her seat to face him fully. "There's almost nothing written about it in the wizarding literature," she said with the tone of someone who has found this profoundly unsatisfying. "Magic is treated as a given. You have it, you learn to use it. The why is considered either divine or irrelevant. But I kept thinking that can't be right. It has to have a mechanism. Everything has a mechanism." "Everything has a mechanism," Harry agreed, and Hermione Granger looked at him like she'd just found something she'd been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. The train began to move. The boy who appeared in the compartment door at somewhere around hour 2 was blonde and had the confident posture of someone who had never had reason to doubt that any room he walked into would rearrange itself to accommodate him. "Potter," he said, looking at Harry with an expression that was trying to be casual and landing somewhere closer to studied. "I heard you were on the train." He looked at Hermione with less interest. "I'm Draco Malfoy." Harry regarded him the way Natasha had taught him to regard anyone who opened a conversation by establishing their own name before asking for yours. "Harry," he said, "not Potter, not Harry Potter, just Harry." Malfoy blinked fractionally. "Right. My father says you might not know everything about the wizarding world, given your upbringing." He made upbringing sound like something you scraped off your shoe, but it was done carefully, plausibly deniable. There are certain families who could give you some context, help you navigate things correctly." "That's thoughtful," Harry said pleasantly. Malfoy relaxed slightly. "I'll keep it in mind," Harry said with a finality that was wrapped so neatly in politeness that it took Malfoy a full second to understand he'd been declined. "The Malfoy family is important, I'm sure," Harry said. "Was there something else you needed, or did you just want to say hello?" The temperature in the compartment dropped about 2 degrees. Malfoy's eyes moved to Harry's hands, to the right hand specifically, where the faint geometric pattern of the gauntlet's filament channels was visible as a slightly different texture on his skin, an imprint from months of training use. His eyes moved back to Harry's face. Something complicated went through them. "We'll see each other at school," Malfoy said and left. Hermione looked at Harry. "That was Draco Malfoy," she said, like this was significant information. "I gathered." His father is on the Hogwarts Board of Governors and has significant influence in the Ministry of Magic and is suspected by a number of historians of having been a supporter of Voldemort, Harry said. Hermione flinched slightly at the name. Yes, the name doesn't hurt, Harry said mildly. It's just a name, Voldemort. See, nothing happened. She looked at him with wide eyes, then, deliberately, Voldemort, she said, and her chin came up slightly as she said it, as if she was testing a weight and finding it manageable. Right, yes. A pause. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know, something more, she waved a hand. Something that needed more protecting, maybe. Harry looked out the window at the countryside rolling past, green and gold and entirely unlike New York in every way. I used to, he said. Then I had 4 years with people who expected me to figure out how not to. Hogwarts arrived like a rumor confirming itself. Harry had seen photographs. Coulson had prepared a thorough briefing document with architectural schematics, historical context, and a shield risk assessment that he'd said was just for your reference, not a call to action. But photographs didn't have the quality of it. The way it sat on its promontory above the lake with every tower and turret apparently added by someone who'd been in the middle of a very strong feeling, and decided to express it architecturally. It was enormous and impossible and absolutely certain of itself, lit against the dark sky with 100 windows burning warm and yellow, and Harry looked at it from the boats with the cold air off the lake in his face and felt something in his chest that wasn't quite awe and wasn't quite recognition, but was somewhere between them. He pressed his hand to the stone wall when they went in through the castle entrance, just briefly, the way he touched the train. The castle was older, much, much older. The magic in the stone was stratified like geological layers, centuries of it, compressed and settled, dense with accumulated human presence and intention. It was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever felt, and he stood there for half a second with his hand flat on the wall and his eyes closed, just reading it. Potter, a nudge from Hermione, we're moving. He fell back into step. A ghost drifted past, the Bloody Baron. He'd read about it, and the other first years pressed slightly away from it, and Harry watched it with interest, and it looked back at him with something that might have been surprise, though it was hard to read expression on something translucent. The Great Hall was staggering in the way that it clearly knew it was staggering and had decided this was everyone else's problem. Harry tilted his head back and looked at the ceiling, the sky, the actual sky, stars and dark cloud, and then brought his attention back level and scanned the room systematically. 4 tables, the staff table at the front, Dumbledore in the center of it. Albus Dumbledore looked exactly like the file photograph, which was to say, ancient, deliberate, and composed in the manner of someone who had been composed for so long it was no longer an effort. He had blue eyes that were doing approximately 11 things at once, and when those eyes landed on Harry, they went very still for a half-second before resuming their placid twinkle, and in that half-second Harry read. Recognition, calculation, something that might have been relief, and something underneath that he filed as interesting and returned to later. Dumbledore had been expecting something smaller, was Harry's read, something more overwhelmed. He tucked that away. The sorting hat was a hat. Harry had known this from the briefing materials, but the briefing materials had not fully conveyed the experience of a faintly musty piece of headwear being placed on your head and immediately starting to talk inside your skull. Interesting, it said, and its mental voice was dry and layered, old in the same way the castle stone was old. Very interesting indeed. Hello, Harry said internally because it seemed polite. You can hear me clearly, it observed. Most students take a moment to adjust. I have practice with voices in my head, Harry said. My suit has an AI. A pause that felt like an elderly professor adjusting their glasses. You are not what I was told to expect. What were you told to expect? Someone frightened, somewhat overwhelmed. Likely Gryffindor from the bloodline context and whatever Albus has been orchestrating. Harry's attention sharpened. Dumbledore talked to you about me. He leaves notes, the hat said with a quality that might have been dry amusement. He has been leaving notes about you for 10 years. Place him where he will be most useful for the greater good. You understand what he means by that. I understand what he thinks he means by it, Harry said. The hat was quiet for a moment. Let me see you properly. It settled and Harry felt it, not unpleasantly, not invasively, but thoroughly, the way a diagnostic scan felt, reading everything that was there. He didn't resist it. He let it read. The silence lasted longer than it had for any other student. Remarkable, it said finally. I have sorted 11,643 students in this school's history. You are the first I have encountered who has been raised outside the magical world and arrived here more complete than most who have grown up inside it. A pause. What do you want from Hogwarts, Harry Potter? Everything it can teach me, Harry said immediately. Everything. The theory, the history, the craft. I want to understand what I am, what this is, how it works from first principles up. I want to meet the other people who have it and learn from them and with them, and I want to be here as myself. A pause, not as what Dumbledore's notes describe. The hat was quiet again, then it said with a finality, "Then there is really only one place for you." It raised its voice to the hall. Gryffindor. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry lifted the hat off his head, placed it back on the stool neatly, and walked to the table. And as he walked, he did not rush, did not duck his head, did not do the overwhelmed smile that the other students had done. He walked like someone who had crossed much more difficult ground than a dining hall and sat down and caught Dumbledore's eye across the room. Dumbledore smiled at him. It was a warm smile, a welcoming smile, a smile that said, "There you are." Harry held the eye contact for a beat and then smiled back, equally warm, equally composed, and looked away first. He heard through his earpiece Tony's voice from New York. "Fridays read the room layout. You good?" "Fine," Harry murmured, barely moving his lips. "The old man's watching you. I know, he's been expecting someone else." A pause. "You good?" Tony asked again, differently this time. "Yeah," Harry said, and meant it both ways. "I'll call you later." Hermione Granger landed at Gryffindor table a moment later, slightly breathless, hat recently removed, and found Harry and sat down across from him with the urgency of someone who had things to discuss. "The hat talked to me," she said quietly. "For a while. Is that normal?" "I think we might be talking about a longer than average sorting," Harry said. "It asked me what I wanted," she said. "Nobody's ever. The books don't say it does that." "What did you tell it?" "The truth," she said, like there was any other option. "That I want to understand everything." She looked at him steadily. "It said I'd do better with someone who asked the same questions I did." "Which I thought was a bit on the nose." Harry looked at her. She looked back. An 11-year-old girl with brown hair and brown eyes and a brain going at an alarming rate, who had spent her first 10 years being told she was too much in exactly the way Harry had been told he was too strange. "Well," he said, "we're probably stuck with each other then." Hermione's expression went through about 4 iterations very rapidly before landing on something that was satisfaction, slightly guarded, holding room for more. "I can work with that," she said. The food appeared on the tables. The great hall roared with noise and light. And somewhere in the castle above them, something old and patient registered the arrival of something new and equally patient, and waited to see what would happen next. Professor Flitwick's first charms class was, by the standard of most first-year experiences, entirely routine. A pleasant, small professor with an enthusiastic approach to his subject, 40 minutes on the history and theory of charm casting, a brief demonstration and then the attempt, Wingardium Leviosa, a simple levitation charm. Harry watched the demonstration carefully. The wand movement was interesting, not because it was complicated, but because he could see what it was doing. The swish and flick described a specific spatial relationship, a direction and a modulation, and the incantation was a phonetic anchor for a mental state. It was, he realized, a technology. A very old, very elegant technology for interfacing a human mind with magical output using the wand as a calibration tool. He'd been doing this for 4 years with Thor and a carved stone, and for the last 3 months, a custom gauntlet. He picked up his wand, 11 inches holly phoenix feather, which had chosen him at Ollivanders in the same way everything in the magical world apparently made decisions about him without consulting him, and performed the motion and said the incantation, and the feather in front of him rose smoothly to exactly the height Flitwick had demonstrated and stopped. Flitwick beamed. "Excellent, Mr. Potter, perfect on the first attempt." "I had a head start," Harry said honestly. From across the table, Hermione Granger had also levitated her feather, a fact she was being precise and methodical about, while the boy to her right, Ronald Weasley, flapped his wand with increasing agitation and said things under his breath that technically weren't swearing. "The motion needs to be smaller," Harry said to Ron without looking up from his own feather, which he was experimenting with, moving it slowly through a figure-8 path. "You're overextending on the flick." "The wand doesn't need the whole arm, it needs the wrist." Ron Weasley had red hair and an expressive face that was currently doing skeptical while his wrist did uncertain. He adjusted. The feather bumped upward 2 inches. "There," Harry said. Ron stared at his feather. Then he looked at Harry with an expression that was making rapid peace with the fact that being helped was okay. "Cheers," he said. "Ron Weasley," Ron added because he'd apparently just realized they hadn't been introduced. "Harry, yeah, I know who you are." "I figured," Harry said. "Does it bother you?" Ron blinked, seemed to genuinely consider it. "Not really," he said with the refreshing honesty of someone who hadn't prepared a position on this. "I've got 6 brothers. Famous doesn't impress me much." Harry felt an immediate positive adjustment in his opinion of Ron Weasley. Potions was the opposite experience, which Harry had half expected from the file. Severus Snape entered the classroom with the energy of someone who had decided at some point that mood was a performance and had committed to it fully. The black robes, the measured pace, the silence that preceded his voice, it was, Harry noted, deeply effective stagecraft. Natasha had taught him to appreciate effective stagecraft even when it was deployed against him. Potter, Snape said during the roll call in a tone that freighted 2 syllables with considerable baggage. Professor, Harry said with equal neutrality. Snape looked at him for a moment that was slightly longer than the others. Then he moved on. The verbal ambush came about 15 minutes into the class, the sequence of rapid-fire questions designed to humiliate a student who hadn't prepared. Harry listened to the first 3 questions, which Snape directed at other students, and understood the mechanism. Questions technical enough to be unanswerable without specific prior knowledge, delivered with just enough contempt to make floundering more likely. Potter, Snape said, turning, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? The draught of living death, Harry said, one of the most powerful sleeping potions known to wizard kind. The asphodel provides the narcotic base, the wormwood carries it across the blood-brain interface. The ratio matters more than most students think. Too much asphodel and the subject wakes within hours rather than sleeping indefinitely. Snape's grade potions text says equal parts, but the original Flammel formulation uses a 3:2 ratio, and most potioneers consider it more reliable. The classroom went very quiet. Snape regarded him with flat black eyes. Where would you look, he said after a beat, if I told you to find me a bezoar, a goat's stomach, specifically the pyloric region, though the duodenal bezoars are more effective. The bezortic properties seem to come from the concentration of tannins in the gastric mucus, which chelates most common poisons. Ineffective against magical poisons not derived from organic compounds, which people often miss. Another silence. What, Snape said with the quality of someone rerouting a plan in real time, is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? They're the same plant, Harry said. Aconitum. The name varies by region and by the specific alkaloid concentration you're working with. Potion-grade wolfsbane has a higher aconitine content by cultivation method. Snape looked at him for a long, precisely calibrated moment. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said, which seemed to physically pain him, and moved on to the practical component of the lesson. Hermione beside Harry had her quill so firmly pressed to her notebook that she'd nearly gone through the page. She leaned fractionally toward him and said very quietly, how do you know all of that? Bruce has a complete digital library of potions texts, Harry said. I read through the first year to third year curriculum on the train. Hermione stared at him. I read fast, Harry said, with a mildness that did not fully conceal the fact that he was enjoying himself. I need to hear more about this digital library, she said, with the tone of someone who had just discovered there was an even bigger library they hadn't been in yet. He found the Mirror of Arist by accident in his 3rd week, wandering a corridor at 1 a.m. that he'd been walking partly because he couldn't sleep and partly because the castle had corridors that pulled at him, that seemed to reshuffle overnight, and he was mapping them the way Tony had taught him to map unknown environments, systematically, with a mental model that he updated with each new pass. The mirror was in an empty classroom, covered in a sheet that had been imperfectly arranged over it, one edge catching the moonlight from the corridor, and Harry lifted the sheet by the corner and looked at it and understood immediately what it was from the Latin inscription curling across the top. Eris stra eru oi ube cafroid on wosi. He parsed it backwards, the way the inscription intended, and stood in front of it and looked at what it showed him. The mirror showed him the common room of Stark Tower. Tony at a workbench, Bruce reading. Natasha doing something with a knife she'd claim was maintenance. Steve looking at something out the window. Thor taking up rather a lot of the couch. Pepper on the phone, laughing at something. And in the middle of them Harry himself, but older, 17 or 18, sitting on the floor with a holographic display up in the gauntlet on his hand, and all of them were there, all of them around him, and it was unmistakably home. He looked at it for about 30 seconds. Then he put the sheet back. He didn't come back to the room, not because the image hurt, it didn't, because the image was real. It wasn't a fantasy, it wasn't an impossible want, it was a place he could walk back to and a family he already had. He didn't need the mirror to show him something he was actively constructing. He told Tony about it in their nightly call, walking back to Gryffindor Tower. Tony said, it shows you what you most want. Harry said, I thought you should know what I saw. A pause on the line. What did you see? Harry described it, exactly as it had appeared. Another pause, longer. Yeah, Tony said, and his voice was doing the thing it had done on Harry's birthday. Yeah, okay, listen, Friday's got an update on the Mark II conductivity readings. I want you to, Tony, Harry said. Recalibrate when you get a chance because the ambient magical field in that castle is about 40 times what we were, Tony. What? I know, Harry said. I wasn't. I know. A beat. Good night. A long pause. Good night, kid, Tony said gruffly, and the line went quiet, and Harry walked back through the shifting corridors of Hogwarts with the castle breathing around him, ancient and enormous and already starting to feel like a different kind of home. The mountain troll on Halloween was, for most of the school, the defining crisis of the term. For Harry, it was more of a calibration exercise. He'd already known Hermione was in the bathroom. He noticed her absence from dinner and the expression she'd been wearing all day since Ron had said something stupid about her showing off, which Harry had told Ron immediately and directly was an idiotic thing to say. He'd been heading for the girls' bathroom before Quirrell's panicked announcement, because he'd heard the troll from 2 corridors away, the heavy footsteps, the walls shaking, and had done a rapid trajectory calculation. He found Hermione backed into the far corner of the bathroom with the troll 12 feet away and various sinks in pieces on the floor. "Harry," she said. "I see it," he said. Troll turned toward him, which was 7 feet of magical creature that smelled like a blocked drain and was currently raising a club the size of a small tree. Harry looked at it, and his magic read it the way he'd learned to read things in motion, size, momentum, center of gravity, the way its weight distributed when it lifted the club. He stepped to the left, drew it a step forward, stepped back. "Go around it," he said to Hermione. "The door is, go around on the left when it commits to the swing." He watched the troll pull back for the strike. "Now," he went right. The club hit the floor with a concussive boom and Harry was already behind it. And his magic reached out, not with force not yet, but with precision, finding the club, the grip, the fulcrum point, and locked it down just for a second, just long enough to pull Hermione clear, and then he released it and let the troll stumble forward under its own momentum. It crashed into the far wall. He and Hermione were at the door. They walked out. He pulled the door mostly shut behind them. "Are you?" Hermione's voice was doing something complicated. "Fine," Harry said. I think yes, how did you?" "Let's talk about it in a minute," he said, because he could hear the sound of running feet from 2 directions that he recognized as the specific cadence of professors moving with urgency, and he wanted them to arrive at a relatively composed scene rather than one that required explaining. McGonagall rounded the corner first, with Snape a step behind and Quirrell trailing. She looked at them at the door at the absence of immediate catastrophe with an expression that was relief, fighting hard to stay behind professionalism. "Potter, Granger, are either of you hurt?" "No, Professor," they said in near unison. McGonagall opened the bathroom door, looked inside. The troll was sitting against the far wall, stunned or confused or possibly just tired, 3 sinks destroyed around it and the club lying 6 feet from where it had last been used. It looked up at McGonagall with the expression of a creature that had not expected its evening to go this way. Snape looked at the troll, looked at Harry and Hermione. His expression gave away precisely nothing. "Weasley," he noted, looking past them to where Ron had arrived slightly breathlessly around a different corner, was presumably also involved. "We all ended up here at the same time," Harry said, which was technically accurate. McGonagall looked at Harry with the specific expression she'd been developing toward him over 3 weeks, which was the expression of a woman who suspected she was not being told everything and had decided to be thoughtful about when to press it. 5 points each to Gryffindor, she said, for dealing with the situation, and 10 points from Gryffindor for the extreme danger of being here at all. She looked at them steadily. "Are you both completely certain you are uninjured?" "Yes, Professor," Hermione said, and there was something in her voice, a slight extra steadiness, the kind that came from having just been frightened and found that the fear had an end point. She glanced at Harry sideways as McGonagall turned to organize the troll's removal. Harry raised his eyebrows slightly. She mouthed, "Thank you." He gave a minimal shrug that meant obviously, and she looked forward again, and Ron Weasley appeared at his elbow and said very quietly, "What happened in there?" "Troll," Harry said. "I know it was a troll. I saw that. I moved the club. She went around. We left." Ron processed this. "You moved the club," he said, "without your wand. Didn't need it." Ron looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating his mental model of a situation. "Right," he said slowly. "So you're actually—" "I grew up with Iron Man," Harry said simply. "The bar for extraordinary is pretty high." Ron was quiet for a moment, then, "That is simultaneously the most normal and most insane sentence I've ever heard." He paused. "Are we friends?" Harry looked at him. Ron Weasley was guileless in a way that was genuinely rare, with absolutely no performance in him, asking a direct question because he wanted a direct answer. "Yeah," Harry said, "I think we probably are." He found Dumbledore's chess game in the 3rd-floor corridor on a night in December when he was there deliberately. He'd been tracking the restricted area since his 2nd week. The magic there was different, layered with wards and something older underneath the wards, something that pulled at him in a way he'd learned to pay attention to. He'd mapped the approach 3 times before he crossed the line. The 3-headed dog was impressive. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at it, Fluffy apparently, which was the most counterintuitively named thing he'd encountered in the magical world. And the magical world had considerable competition on that front. And the dog looked back at him with 3 sets of enormous eyes, and Harry felt the magic rolling off it in waves and smelled the harp music from somewhere faint but present, and looked at the trapdoor beneath its paws. He stood there for about 60 seconds. Then he went back to Gryffindor Tower, sat on his bed, and opened his earpiece. "Tony," he said. "It's midnight," Tony said. "I know, there's a three-headed dog guarding a trapdoor in the third floor of the school. The magic beneath it feels like it's protecting something significant. Something with a particular resonance I want to describe to you and Bruce because I think it might be important." A pause. "I'm getting Bruce. I figured. Also, and I want to be clear that this is a parenting concern, not a tactical one. I wasn't going through the trapdoor," Harry said. "That's what I wanted to hear." "Tonight," Harry added. A longer pause. "Bruce," Tony said, away from the receiver, "you're going to want to get in here." Harry sat cross-legged on his bed and described everything he'd felt, the quality of the magic, the layers of the wards, the specific resonance of the thing beneath them, and let Bruce and Tony build models around it. And outside the Gryffindor Tower windows the Scottish night was enormous and dark and cold. And in the castle below him, something very old and very precious sat in the dark and waited without knowing that the thing that would determine its future was a boy with an earpiece and green eyes who had learned, from the very best, how to be patient. The first Quidditch match was almost an afterthought, given everything else. Harry had been put on the team by McGonagall after an incident involving a flying situation that he'd resolved in a way she'd apparently decided to interpret as talent rather than cheating. He wasn't certain he'd call it talent exactly. He'd grown up in a tower with a view of the sky, and he'd been on a flying simulation in Tony's training floor since he was 9, and the broom under him felt natural in the particular way things felt natural when your body already knew the physics, weight, speed, arc, wind resistance, the subtle language of motion. He caught the snitch in 4 minutes and 37 seconds, which was apparently a record, and nobody in the crowd knew about the split second where his broom had lurched, and he'd steadied it not with his hands but with a quick flex of magic, locking his center of gravity to the broom's trajectory with a precision that would have taken years to develop through wand technique alone. Professor Quirrell, watching from the stands, had his wand out. Someone was countering the jinx. Harry had felt both the destabilization and the correction, and filed the first one carefully. He landed and held up the snitch, and the Gryffindor end of the stadium erupted, and Ron nearly knocked him over with an uncoordinated tackle that he was fairly sure was meant to be a hug. Hermione grabbed his arm briefly with her fingers, not the celebration, just a half-second of contact that said something more specific and more important, something like, "I saw what happened. I have questions." Later, he thought back because he'd found she could read his silences almost as well as he could read hers. He caught Dumbledore's eye across the pitch. The headmaster was applauding, blue eyes doing their complex reading of him, and Harry looked back steadily and then looked away and thought, Quirrell, of course. He called Tony from the changing room. "There's someone in this school who wanted me off that broom," he said. "Yeah," Tony said. "Friday picked up a magical interference signature on your biometric feed at the 3-minute mark. I was about to tell you. I figured it out. I know, I watched you figure it out on your face. A beat." "You need extraction." "No," Harry said. "But I want to run through everything we know about Voldemort's lieutenants and where they went after the First War." He looked at his hand, no gauntlet. He'd left it in the trunk. The match hadn't called for it. "I think I might need the full picture. I'll have a file ready by the time you call tonight." A pause. "Harry." "Yeah, good catch," Tony said. Harry smiled, put the earpiece away, walked out of the changing room into the cold Scottish air with the snitch still warm in his hand, pulsing its tiny golden wings against his palm, and looked up at the castle above him and thought, "All right then, let's see what you are." Chapter 4, The Blueprint. The Philosopher's Stone was, in the end, less about the stone and more about the man. Harry had known this by February of first year, had mapped the logic of it with Tony and Bruce over a series of late-night calls that had become a standing fixture in his weekly routine, Tuesday and Friday at 11 p.m. Hogwarts time, which was 6 p.m. New York, which was when Tony was between projects and Bruce had finished his tea, and Friday had routed a secure encrypted channel through a satellite array that would have made the British government very nervous if they'd known it existed. "Quirrell is the obvious play," Tony had said on one of those calls. "He's got access, he's got motivation, and he's been acting as the interference layer. But Quirrell doesn't want the stone for himself. He's a vehicle," Harry had agreed. "Voldemort needs a body. The stone gives him one, eventually, the elixir of life, sustained use, the math works out." He'd been lying on his stomach on his bed with the holographic schematic of the third-floor obstacle course floating 6 inches above the mattress, which Friday had reconstructed from his descriptions and the biometric data from his 3 scouting passes. The chess set is the hardest obstacle. The logic puzzle with the potions is the second hardest. The rest are manageable. The chess set is Minerva McGonagall's contribution. Bruce had said from somewhere off mic, which meant he'd been reading while listening, which was a Bruce Banner specialty. Her magical signature would be in the enchantment. Ron Weasley is a notably strong chess player. Ron's good enough that the enchanted pieces will play to his skill level, Harry had said, which is useful. He looked at the schematic. But we don't need to use the chess route. Tony had been quiet for a moment. You're going through the dog, Fluffy responds to music. The mechanism is probably Sather adjacent, an auditory anchor for a specific magical state. I can generate a tone with the magic that mimics the effect. He'd paused. I've been practicing. Of course you have, Tony had said, and there'd been something in his voice that was pride and exasperation in exact equal measure. When are you going? Not until it becomes necessary. And when is that? When someone else tries to go first, Harry had said, and we're out of time to let things develop naturally. The natural development had happened on the last day of spring term, when a combination of overheard conversations, a letter from Hagrid about a dragon egg, and a network-level read of the school's emotional atmosphere, Dumbledore called away, Quirrell desperate, the obstacles too close to being breached, had converged into what Tony called your window. He'd brought Ron and Hermione. This had not been tactical sentimentality. Ron's chess ability was a genuine asset, and Hermione's logical mind was exactly what the potion puzzle required. He'd briefed both of them that afternoon with the efficiency of someone who'd grown up watching strategy sessions between Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff. And Ron had said, so we're going through the dog, with the tone of someone deciding this was fine. And Hermione had said the logical puzzle will have a finite solution set. I can work it out in under 2 minutes. And Harry had thought, yeah, these are my people. Fluffy had been managed with a tone he'd generated through the magic, a held frequency in his throat that wasn't quite singing and wasn't quite anything else. And the 3 heads had gone down like lights going out. And Ron had said, that's one of the stranger things I've seen, and I grew up with Fred and George, so that's saying something. The obstacles had gone as modeled, mostly. The devil's snare had tried, but Hermione's knowledge and Harry's fire, controlled, precise, a blowtorch not a bonfire, had cleared it in 11 seconds. The keys had been Ron's idea on the broken-winged one, and it was a genuinely good idea that Harry told him so immediately. The chess game Ron had played with white-knuckled brilliance, and the potion puzzle Hermione had cracked in 90 seconds, not 2 minutes, and she'd looked slightly pleased with herself about the 10-second margin. He'd sent them both back with the right potion bottle. He'd gone on alone. Quirrell's back in the mirror chamber was the least surprising reveal of the year, which was saying something. What was interesting was Voldemort's face in the back of the turban, not the grotesque horror of it, though it was objectively horrific, but the expression. Dark eyes, degraded and furious and focused, and the moment they'd landed on Harry they'd changed in a way that was hard to name. Not anger. Not contempt, something more complex. Harry Potter, Voldemort said through Quirrell's mouth. That's me, Harry said. The chamber was circular, the mirror of Arist at its center, and Harry stood in front of it and didn't look at it, kept his eyes on Quirrell while his peripheral awareness tracked the room. He had the gauntlet on his right hand. He'd brought it from his trunk the day before, had calibrated it at 3 in the morning while the castle slept, had run 3 output tests on the roof that Friday had logged and Tony had reviewed at 6 a.m. New York time with a coffee and his jaw set and said, "It's ready, you're ready." "You seek the stone," Voldemort said. "I wasn't actually," Harry said. "I was stopping you from taking it." "A child stops me." The voice was contemptuous. "A child raised by muggles and their toys." "My dad built the suit that helped defeat an alien invasion," Harry said conversationally. "And you spent the last decade possessing animals in the Albanian forest. I don't think either of us should be too proud." Quirrell's face twitched. Voldemort's eyes in the back of the turban narrowed, not in anger exactly. "In something that was recalibrating. The stone," Voldemort said. "The mirror shows it to the one who wants to find it but not use it. Look into the mirror, boy." Harry looked at the mirror. His reflection looked back. The stone appeared in the reflection's hand, and then it was in his pocket. He felt it, solid and warm and faintly humming with a magic that was ancient and incredibly dense and extraordinary. He kept his expression entirely neutral. "Give me the stone," Voldemort said. "No," Harry said. "Do you understand what I am?" "Yes," Harry said. "You're a very powerful wizard who found a way to survive death through splitting your soul into fragments, which is impressive technically and genuinely horrifying ethically, and who has spent the last however many years diminished and furious and trying to get back to a physical form." He paused. "You're also currently a parasite on a man who has about 3 months to live regardless of whether I do anything tonight. You don't have leverage, you have a clock." Quirrell attacked. He was fast. Harry had underestimated the speed, which he noted for future reference, and the first curse hit the air where Harry had been a half-second ago, which was now empty because Harry had moved. The gauntlet flared as he brought his arm up, and the curse scattered off a shield that hadn't been fully shaped yet but was dense enough to deflect it. Quirrell threw another. Harry let it come, let it close to 3 feet, and hit it with a precisely shaped pulse that bent the trajectory 45 degrees into the floor. The filaments are running hot, Friday murmured in his ear. Output is elevated but stable. Watch the left side. He'd already seen the left side, Quirrell circling, trying to flank. Harry moved to put the mirror at his back and watched them both. You could walk away, Harry said to Quirrell, not to Voldemort, to the man. He's killing you. Quirrell's face contorted. You can't understand. The debt, the obligation, the belief that this is worth it. Harry watched him. I do understand. I just think you're wrong about what he'd do for you if positions were reversed. Enough, Voldemort said. Quirrell lunged. Harry caught him by the wrist. The scream was immediate and extraordinary and terrible. Quirrell tried to pull back, and Harry held on because the logic was simple. Wherever Voldemort was reciting was in the back of Quirrell's skull, and physical contact was burning them. And that burning was buying Hermione and Ron and every person on the other side of the door time and safety. He held on for the 5 seconds he could manage, 5 seconds of a sound he would never entirely forget, and then released and stepped back. Quirrell collapsed. Dumbledore appeared through the door before the echo of the fall had settled, moving with a speed that suggested he'd been closer than Harry had thought, and took in the scene with those blue eyes that were doing 6 things at once and settled finally on Harry. Harry took the stone from his pocket and held it out. I believe this is the thing you were trying to protect, he said. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Quirrell on the floor. He looked at the mirror. He looked back at Harry, and in his expression was something that had not been there before, something that was not the chess player's assessment, not the greater good calculation, but something older and more uncertain. Something that might have been the beginning of actually seeing. Are you hurt? Dumbledore asked. No, Harry said, but I'd like to call my dad. The conversation with Dumbledore happened in the hospital wing the following morning, where Madame Pomfrey had installed Harry for observation despite his absence of injuries with a firmness that suggested this was non-negotiable. Dumbledore sat in the visitor's chair with his fingers laced and his half-moon glasses and the expression of a man composing himself. You knew it was Quirrell, Dumbledore said. Since October, Harry said, when he tried to jinx my broom. And you said nothing. To whom? Harry asked. The person running the school who'd put the stone there and arranged the obstacles. I needed to know more before I knew who I was talking to. He held Dumbledore's gaze. I know about the prophecy. I know what you think it means. Dumbledore was very still. I know about the Horcruxes, Harry said, which was the piece he'd saved, the information Bruce and Tony had found in the SHIELD intelligence files compiled from Wizarding World surveillance spanning 30 years, cross-referenced with what Harry had sensed in the structure of Voldemort's magic the night before. Not all of them, but enough to understand the scale of what you've been planning. He paused. What you've been planning around me. Harry, you can tell me, Harry said. I'm not angry. I want to understand your actual reasoning, not the managed version. He looked at the old man steadily. Because I think you've been playing a very long game and you've got to a point where you've forgotten that the pieces move on their own. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment that went on long enough to change its quality several times. Then he said, you are nothing like what I expected. I know, Harry said. Who taught you to all of this? Tony Stark taught me to take things apart and understand them. Natasha Romanoff taught me to read people and situations. Steve Rogers taught me to not stop. Thor taught me that magic is a door you open, not a flood you survive. Bruce Banner taught me that everything has a mechanism. He paused. The Dursleys taught me what happens when someone decides you are only as valuable as your usefulness to them. I'm not planning to repeat that particular lesson. Dumbledore was quiet for a very long time. There are things coming, he said finally. I know. Things I have perhaps managed rather than shared. Yes, I would like, Dumbledore said slowly, like each word was something he was choosing from a larger set, to try a different approach, if you would allow it. Harry considered him. Albus Dumbledore was one of the most powerful wizards alive, and also a man who had been carrying a particular weight alone for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Harry could see both things simultaneously, which was something he'd learned from every person who'd raised him. Tell me about the Horcruxes, Harry said. All of them, everything you know. Dumbledore told him. It took 2 hours. By the end of it, the morning light had moved across the hospital wing floor and Madame Pomfrey had brought tea twice. And Dumbledore looked 5 years older and 5 years lighter, and Harry had been taking mental notes, with the focused precision of someone trained to retain briefings. Right, Harry said when it was done. Right, Dumbledore echoed. We have a plan to make, Harry said. A real one, not a managed one. But not yet. I need to go home for the summer first. He stood up, which Madame Pomfrey had said he wasn't to do yet, and he felt absolutely fine. And I need you to understand something. What is that? Whatever the prophecy says, whatever it means, I'm going to face Voldemort on my own terms, not yours, not his. He looked at the headmaster. But I'm willing to have you in the room when the plan is made, if you can work with that. Dumbledore looked at him over his half-moon glasses, and the chess player was mostly gone from his expression now, or at least quieter, and what was there instead was something harder to name and perhaps more genuine. I believe I can, he said. Second year passed in the way that significant years sometimes do, loudly, with a monster in the pipes. The basilisk was a genuinely interesting problem. Harry had spent September and October cross-referencing the petrification cases with the castle's original plumbing schematics, which Friday had found in the Hogwarts property records archived in the Scottish Historical Buildings Registry, because Tony Stark's AI had no respect for institutional boundaries and had identified the Chamber of Secrets' probable location by December. He told Dumbledore, who had looked at him with the particular expression Harry was coming to understand meant I should have thought of that. And also I'm beginning to suspect you think about 3 moves ahead at all times. He'd found the entrance in February. He'd waited until April, when Tom Riddle's diary had been established as the source in Ginny Weasley's increasingly distant behavior had crossed a threshold that Harry felt was the difference between manageable and urgent. He'd gone into the chamber with Ron and Lockhart, who had been in the manner of accidents that nevertheless have outcomes, exactly the tool the situation required, in that his memory charm had been more useful redirected at the rockfall than anything else he'd contributed. And the basilisk had been the single most impressive creature Harry had ever faced, which was accounting for Asgardian wildlife Thor had described in his stories. He'd gone in with his wand, the gauntlet, and Fawkes, who had arrived in the manner of someone whose timing was impeccable and whose contribution was incandescent. The basilisk's eyes he dealt with by closing his own and reading the creature through the magic instead. Positional awareness, mass, movement, the heat of it in the air. The venom had gotten him anyway, through his shoulder before the fang broke. And Fawkes had cried on the wound, and it had been extraordinary, the feeling of phoenix tears, something that moved through him like light through water, warm and certain and definitive. Tom Riddle had watched it all, and Tom Riddle had made a tactical error. You'll die, Riddle had said, standing over him in the seconds before Fawkes arrived. Even now, Dumbledore's not here, your muggle toys are insufficient. You're going to die in this chamber as the last worthy act of your worthless life. Harry had looked up at him from the floor, shoulder bleeding black, and thought, there it is. The shape of it, not a dark lord, a boy who was told once he was worthless and decided the whole world would pay for it. You're 16 in a diary, Harry had said through the pain. I'm 12 with a gauntlet, we're not as similar as you think. He'd stabbed the diary with the basilisk fang on the floor beside him. Riddle had screamed and dissolved. Fawkes had arrived 30 seconds later, which Harry had privately thought was rather theatrical timing, but he'd been in no position to critique. Third year was Sirius Black. The Dementors on the train were the first test, a cold that descended on him that had nothing to do with temperature, a pulling pressure at the edges of his mind, and from the dark the beginning of a voice he recognized as his mother's, which had hit him with a force he had not anticipated. He'd held it, not easily. But the door was well established by now, and he pushed back against the cold with an anchor that was very specific. The common room of Stark Tower, 4 people on a couch, a cake that was falling apart, and the Dementor had moved away. And he'd come back to himself in the dark compartment with his hands on his knees and Hermione beside him and a new professor handing him chocolate. Remus Lupin was one of the best teachers Harry had encountered anywhere, which was a high bar. He taught defense with the clarity of someone who understood that understanding a threat was more important than fearing it, and his approach to the Patronus was theoretical before it was practical, which Harry appreciated. The Patronus is a projection of a positive memory, Lupin had said in their first extra session, sufficiently powerful to drive out the despair Dementor imposes. The mechanism is, well, we don't fully understand the mechanism, if I'm honest. I think I might, Harry had said. Lupin had looked at him. The Dementor takes away the capacity for positive thought by consuming what generates it, some kind of emotional energy, warm, associative. The Patronus reintroduces that energy externally as a projection. It's like the Dementor is taking the charge out of the battery and the Patronus is a generator. He paused. The memory isn't the power source, it's the interface. The actual output is the emotion it produces, which is what the Dementor responds to. Lupin had been quiet for a long moment. Where did you learn to think like that? I grew up with scientists, Harry had said. The Patronus had taken him 3 sessions to produce because he kept trying to find the right memory. And the memory had kept being the same one, not dramatic, not triumphant. Just Tony at a workbench at midnight with a cup of terrible coffee saying, hold the filament steady. I need to see the distribution, and he kept dismissing it as insufficient. On the 3rd session, Lupin had said, what memory keeps coming up? Harry had told him. Use that one, Lupin had said immediately. The Patronus had erupted on the first attempt, enormous. A stag, silver-white, and the room had gone 3 shades brighter, and Lupin had sat down very suddenly in his chair with an expression that was doing something private and complicated. A stag, Lupin had said quietly. Yeah, Harry had said, watching it pace. Is that significant? Lupin had looked at it for a moment with those tired, careful eyes. Your father's animagus form was a stag, he'd said. His name was Prongs. Harry had looked at the patroness. At the line of its shoulders, the angle of its head. He'd thought about the photograph he'd seen once in Dumbledore's office. James Potter, young, laughing with an ease about him that the photographs of the war years hadn't managed to capture. He'd said he'd sat with it for a day. The fact that his deepest joy had produced the same form as his biological father's deepest self. He'd examined it from all angles, looking for the meaning he was supposed to take from it, and in the end he'd called Tony. My patroness is a stag, he'd said. Like my biological dad. Tony had been quiet for a moment. How do you feel about that? I think it's interesting, Harry had said honestly. I think it means something about what I carry, where I came from, but it doesn't feel like a direction. He'd paused. It feels like information. Good, Tony had said. Information is what you do something with. Sirius Black had been the year's central axis, and he'd arrived at its resolution with the same logic he applied to all complex problems. Start from what you know to be true and work outward. What he knew, Sirius Black had been his parents' secret keeper. His parents were dead. Peter Pettigrew was supposedly also dead. Scabbers, Ron's rat, had been missing a toe for 12 years. What he'd established by February, in a research session with Hermione and a wizarding forensics text from the library's restricted section, Pettigrew, not Black, had been the actual secret keeper. The evidence for Sirius's guilt was entirely circumstantial and had never been tested in court because Sirius Black had never had a trial. He told Dumbledore in March. Dumbledore had listened, and then he had done something Harry didn't expect. He had said very quietly, I know. And then, there are things I should have done in the immediate aftermath of that night that I did not do, because I was moving too quickly toward the next crisis. Harry had looked at him. I am not always, Dumbledore had said carefully, as wise as I appear. I know, Harry had said without unkindness, but you're learning. Dumbledore had laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and then looked at Harry with an expression that was still doing calculations but was now doing different ones, better ones. Sirius Black in person was a man who had been shattered by a decade of Azkaban, and was fitting himself back together with the urgency of someone who knew the pieces had shifted, and the original shape might not work anymore. Harry had met him in the Shrieking Shack with an openness that had surprised Sirius, who had apparently expected fear or anger or grief. You're very calm, Sirius had said. I grew up with people who taught me that panic is a waste of a first response, Harry had said. Are you innocent? Yes. Can you prove it? Pettigrew, the rat, they'd looked at Scabbers. What followed had been complicated by Lupin's transformation and Pettigrew's escape and the general chaos of a Scottish moor at midnight, and they'd lost the legal proof, and Harry had sat with that outcome, genuinely disappointed, genuinely angry about the injustice of it, for about 24 hours. Then he'd sat down with Hermione, who'd had a time turner for 3 months that she'd been using for coursework with a responsibility that was almost painful to observe, and said, Can we use it for something else? Technically, it's only authorized for academic. Hermione. She'd looked at him, looked at the time turner. We saved Sirius and Buckbeak, she'd said. That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing, Harry agreed. They'd done it with a precision that even Natasha would have appreciated. 3 hours in the past. 2 teenagers moving through the castle's shadows using every technique Harry had been taught and Hermione had independently developed. And the hippogriff had landed on the astronomy tower, and Sirius had looked at Harry from its back with an expression like someone learning something fundamental about the world. Your father would be, Sirius had started. Fly, Harry had said, because the window was closing and they needed to go. We'll talk. I'll come find you when it's safe. Sirius had flown. Harry had watched him go and then looked at Hermione, who looked back, both of them sitting in the knowledge of something managed precisely, and she'd said, That worked. It did. I feel like I should sit down. We can do that, Harry had said, in about an hour when past us comes around that corner and we have to not be here. She'd laughed, short and slightly hysterical. He'd grinned. They'd moved. 4th year was the tournament, and the tournament was, in retrospect, the clearest thing Voldemort had done yet, which was to say it was intelligent, patient, and built around a correct understanding of Harry's weaknesses, which was impressive because Voldemort's information on Harry was 4 years out of date. He'd known his name was in the goblet by the register of Dumbledore's expression, which had gone still in the specific way that meant rapid internal crisis management. The hall had gone quiet, and Harry had stood up and walked to the front because there wasn't a productive alternative, and because making a scene would have served nobody's interests. McGonagall had looked at him with an expression that was professional concern layered over genuine worry. I didn't put my name in, Harry had said to the room, to Dumbledore, to McGonagall, clearly without defensiveness, because the truth was simple and he had no reason to hedge it. Whether or not, Dumbledore had started. I didn't put my name in, Harry had said again. Someone did it for me using magic sufficient to overcome the age line, which means someone with significant power wanted me in this tournament. The question worth asking is why. He'd looked at Dumbledore. I think we both have a guess. The preparation had been thorough. Tony had upgraded the gauntlet over summer. Mark III, higher filament density, improved power distribution. A secondary containment field around the arc element that meant Harry could push harder without the conductors degrading. The first task had been designed for fear, for unpreparedness, and Harry had watched Cedric and Crumb and Fleur face their dragons and then walked into the arena and looked at the Hungarian Horntail and thought, she's protecting her eggs. That's what this is about. He'd moved away from the eggs slowly, deliberately, with the specific body language of something not threatening. The dragon had tracked him. He'd moved in a wide arc and she'd tracked, and the nest was behind her now, and the egg was 6 feet to his left. And when she'd committed to a forward lunge, he'd already been moving, the gauntlet flaring as he used the momentum of the lunge to clear the distance in 2 steps and had the egg in his hands and was 20 feet away before she'd reset. The crowd had made a sound that wasn't quite a roar because it had happened too fast for roaring. He'd looked at the score numbers and then looked at Cedric Diggory in the champion's tent, who had a burn on his arm and was watching Harry with an expression that was equal parts impressed and wry. You talked to it, Cedric had said. Not talked exactly, Harry had said. Read it. She was scared. Scared things are predictable. Cedric had looked at him for a moment. I'm glad you're not my enemy, he'd said. You're not mine either, Harry had said. Let's both get to the end of this. They'd worked together on the egg, Cedric's idea to submerge it, Harry's read of the merpeople's song pattern, and the second task had been the lake, and the second task had been the one that had cost him most, because the thing Voldemort's agent had taken as his most missed thing was not the Weasleys, not Hermione, not even Sirius. It was Tony. He'd found Tony sitting at the bottom of the lake in Dumbledore's magic, in the dreamlike way of the merpeople's enchantment, sitting in a chair with his coffee. And for a half-second, he'd stood in the cold, dark water and felt something that wasn't fear exactly but was adjacent to it, something like the understanding of what it would cost him if this were real. He'd broken the enchantment in 48 minutes, retrieved Tony's likeness from the lake bed, got Hermione on his way up out of impulse, and because abandoning her wasn't something his body was capable of doing even in an enchantment. He'd surfaced and breathed and been docked points for the overtime and hadn't cared at all. You saw me, Tony had said that night on the call. Not a question. It was an illusion, Harry had said, but you saw me. Yeah, a long pause. You okay? I'm fine, Harry had said. It clarified some things. Like what? Like how I respond to the specific fear of losing specific people, Harry had said. It's useful data. Tony had been quiet for a moment. You're going to give me gray hair before I'm 60, he'd said. You already have gray hair. More gray hair. Harry had smiled in the dark of his dormitory. Go to sleep, he'd said. I'll call you after the third task. He hadn't quite, because the third task had ended with a graveyard and a cauldron and the year's blood-cold surprise. Voldemort restored. Cedric dead, Harry holding Cedric's body in his wand with the portkey clutched in his bleeding hand. And the moment when prior incantatum had connected their wands and the echoes had come out of the dark. And among them James Potter, who had looked at his son with the calm eyes of someone with very little time and had said simply, We're proud of you, all of us. Let go when you're ready. Harry had let go. He'd landed in the maze. He'd still been holding Cedric. The chaos that followed was significant. Dumbledore's face when Harry had emerged was the most open Harry had ever seen it, stripped of the chess player entirely down to the man underneath, who was frightened and grieving and had been carrying too much for too long. Harry had let Madame Pomfrey take him, had sat in the hospital wing with Cedric's parents in the waiting room and the sound of his own breathing, and had done what Natasha had taught him, felt it, all of it, without performing it and without suppressing it. Felt the weight of Cedric, who had been a decent and honorable person, felt the cold of the graveyard, felt Voldemort's power, felt the echo of his father's voice. He'd sat with all of it. Then he'd called Tony. Tony had picked up on the first ring. I need 5 minutes, Harry had said, and then I want to talk about what I know about his current state of power and what we build next. Tony had been quiet for exactly 5 minutes. He'd sat on the line and said nothing and done nothing except be there, which was the thing Harry had needed. Then he'd said, Okay, tell me everything. Harry had told him everything. They'd talked until 4 in the morning, and by the end of it there were 3 holographic models running in the New York workshop and a list of 17 action items and a preliminary framework for the Infinity Suit's next iteration. And Tony had said, You know what this means, right? It means we stop waiting for him to make the next move, Harry had said. It means we start building toward his, Tony had said. You get home in 3 weeks, we're starting immediately. Harry had looked at the gray pre-dawn light gathering at the hospital wing window. In the corridor outside, he could hear Fox singing, not loudly, just threading through the stone walls, the way Phoenix song did, like it belonged in the structure of the building. 3 weeks, he'd said. I'll have the workshop ready, Tony had said, and a proper breakfast, Harry had said, not a protein bar. I make no promises about breakfast, kid. I know, Harry had said. Good night, Tony. Good night, Tony had said, and the line had gone quiet, and Harry had pressed the earpiece back into his palm and looked at the ceiling and thought about Cedric Diggory and James Potter and the specific feeling of his wand resonating with another. And then he'd stood up and put his feet on the floor and thought, all right, let's build something. Chapter 5. The suit. The workshop in July smelled like ozone and coffee, and something chemical that Friday had flagged 3 times as a ventilation concern before Tony had told her to add it to the list of concerns she was managing quietly. Harry had been home for 48 hours when the building began in earnest. Not the suit specifically, the suit had been building in both their heads for 2 years. Pieces of it developed in those late-night calls, refined through tournament data and graveyard readings, and the complete biometric profile Friday had been compiling since the Mark I Gauntlet's first calibration. What began in those first 48 hours was something harder to name. A recognition between 2 people who had both been in significant danger separately and had come home to each other and were now, without discussing it directly, processing the fact that the world had changed and they were going to change with it. Tony worked the way he always worked when something had frightened him, by building, continuously, the drafting table covered in schematics by the end of the first day. 3 new alloy compositions being synthesized in the fabricator while he talked through load distribution with Friday. Harry sat on the workshop floor in his usual spot, back against the secondary workbench, legs crossed, and watched, and interjected when Tony's engineering assumptions about the magical interface were wrong, which was often, because Tony's instinct was always to build toward maximum output and Harry's instinct was to build toward precision. Output without precision is a fire hose, Harry said on day 2 when Tony was arguing for a higher density arc element in the chest plate. I already have significant raw output. What I need is accuracy at range, sustained channeling capacity, and the ability to modulate the frequency of the magical field so I can interface with different kinds of magic, wards, curses, ambient environmental magic. The arc element needs to serve the modulator, not the other way around. Tony stopped, put down his stylus, looked at the holographic schematic, made 3 changes. Like that. The modulator housing needs to be accessible for in-field adjustment, Harry said. I need to be able to change the frequency manually if Friday doesn't have a read on what I'm facing. Gauntlet, Tony said, and Friday immediately rotated the schematic to show the right gauntlet in detail. Manual dial here, recessed so it doesn't catch on impact. 5 preset frequencies, infinite manual range. Interface surface, he looked at Harry. What material does the interface surface need to be? Runic inscription, Harry said. Thor's been sending me texts from Asgardian Sather manuals. There are inscription compounds that the magic reads as language. If I engrave the right arrays into the interface surface, the suit will speak to the magic directly rather than just conducting it. Tony stared at him. You want me to put magic spells on my engineering? I want you to expand the definition of engineering, Harry said. Tony pointed at him. That was a me sentence. You just used a me sentence on me. I've been living with you for 8 years, Harry said. I was going to start eventually. Bruce appeared in the workshop doorway with 2 cups of tea and the expression of a man who had heard the last exchange and found it more gratifying than he was going to say. He set a cup beside Harry and handed one to Tony and looked at the schematic. Runic arrays on the interface surface, he said. Do we have access to the inscription compounds? Thor's bringing them in September, Harry said. He says there are 3 Asgardian runewrights who'd be interested in the collaboration. He described it to them as a Midgardian engineering project of unusual ambition, which I think is the most diplomatically accurate way he could have put it. Bruce looked at the schematic for a long moment. The frequency modulator interacting with a runic array and an arc element in the same system, the resonance interference could be significant. We'd need a buffer layer. He set down his tea and pulled a stool over. Can I? Please, Tony said and moved sideways, and Bruce sat down at the drafting table. And Harry watched the 2 of them begin to argue constructively about buffer layer composition in the way they always did when they were both genuinely excited about a problem, and the workshop hummed around them. And outside the tower, the city was doing its loud, indifferent summer thing, and Harry thought, this is where it starts. The real thing. Natasha found him on the roof on day 3. He'd gone up at midnight because the workshop had gotten to the stage where Tony and Bruce needed to argue without a third party moderating, which happened every project at roughly the 40-hour mark. The city was thick with summer heat even at midnight, the air above the rooftop shimmering slightly, and Harry was sitting on the parapet where Thor always sat, legs hanging over the edge, the Mark III gauntlet on his right hand, doing something he'd been working on for 2 months. Trying to generate a sustained magical field with enough frequency range to encompass both his own native output and the ambient environmental magic in a specific area. It felt, when he got it right, like tuning a radio to a station that was broadcasting on multiple frequencies simultaneously. He'd gotten it right twice in the last hour for about 8 seconds each time, and the city below him had done something strange, not visibly but perceptibly, a brief shiver in the air like a chord resolution. "What does that feel like?" Natasha said from behind him. "Like singing and listening at the same time," Harry said without turning. He'd heard her cross the roof. She'd been working on being quieter around him for 3 years, which he'd told her once was a losing proposition because he could feel people in a space the same way he could feel objects. She'd given him a very specific look that had said, "That's not a reason to stop trying." She sat beside him on the parapet, which she did with the complete ease of someone to whom heights were logistical rather than emotional. She looked at the city. "How was the graveyard?" she asked. Nobody else had asked. Tony had asked about the data. Bruce had asked about Voldemort's power signature. Dumbledore had asked about what Harry had observed. Steve had looked at him when he got back and said, "I'm here if you need to talk," in a way that meant, whenever, no pressure, the offer doesn't expire. But Natasha had waited 4 days for the right moment, which was exactly when he was doing something that required presence rather than performance, and then asked the direct question. "Bad," Harry said. "How bad?" "Cedric Diggory was good," Harry said. "Not extraordinary, not famous, just decent. He shook my hand at the beginning of the tournament and meant it. He'd have been a good Auror or a good ministry official or a good farmer, whatever he decided to do." He looked at the city. He didn't deserve the end of his story to be a demonstration of someone else's power. Natasha was quiet. "It made me angry," Harry said, "not in the way that goes away. In the way that settles." He flexed his right hand, watched the gauntlet's filaments catch the light. "I'm not going to let that happen to anyone else I can stop it happening to." "That's a significant weight to carry," Natasha said. "It's the right weight," Harry said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. Her expression was in the register he'd learned over years to read accurately, not soft exactly, not hard exactly, something in between that was real in a way her performed expressions weren't. "You're 15, she said. "You were younger than me the first time you did something irrevocable for a cause you believed in," he said. "Not an accusation, a fact," said gently. "You don't actually think age is the variable?" A pause. "No," she said. "I think awareness is the variable, whether you know what you're choosing." "I know what I'm choosing," Harry said. "Then the weight is yours," Natasha said, and the way she said it was a kind of permission, not for the danger but for the seriousness of it, for the right to be taken as he was rather than managed back toward something smaller and safer. "The suit," she said after a moment. "Tell me what you're building it toward." "Voldemort has Horcruxes," Harry said. 7 originally, we think 2 might already be destroyed based on what Dumbledore's been doing quietly for a decade. That leaves up to 5. He can't be killed while they exist. So the plan has 2 components: find and destroy the remaining Horcruxes and then face him directly in conditions of my choosing, not his. He looked at the gauntlet. "The suit is what makes the second part survivable, maybe winnable. What does it need to do? Protect me from killing curses, or at minimum, reduce their effect significantly. A killing curse is magic targeting the soul's connection to the body. If I can build a containment field around my own magical signature, something that essentially tells the universe I'm not available for disconnection, that might be enough." He paused. "Thor thinks it's theoretically possible. He knows of Asgardian warriors who have survived magic-killing attacks using Sather-based full-body warding. The runic arrays I'm building into the suit are a version of that." Natasha processed this with the systematic quiet of someone who evaluated plans for a living. "And if the Horcruxes can't all be found in time, then we change the timeline," Harry said. "We find a faster way." Faster meaning. Meaning Dumbledore's been working on this alone, slowly, carefully, because his fundamental approach is to position me as the final piece rather than an active participant in the preparation. Harry looked at her. "I'm an active participant. That changes the pace." Natasha looked at the city for a moment. Then she said, "I want to come. To Hogwarts, to wherever the Horcruxes lead, when the hunting begins." She held his gaze. "Don't tell me it's too dangerous." "I wasn't going to," Harry said. "I was going to say yes." The corner of her mouth moved. "Good." She stood up easily from the parapet. "Come down and eat something. Tony hasn't eaten since breakfast because he's pretending he doesn't need to, and Bruce is going to forget to remind him." Harry swung his legs back over the parapet and dropped to the rooftop. "I'll handle it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking you." The Hogwarts fifth year was the Ministry of Magic at its most comprehensively obstructive, and Harry found it less enraging than the year Cedric died, which told him something useful about the hierarchy of things that could affect him. Dolar's Umbridge arrived with the specific energy of a person who had decided that control and safety were the same thing, which was one of the more dangerous confusions Harry had encountered in any world. She was pink and soft-spoken and absolutely certain of herself, and her certainty was of the kind that had never been seriously tested, which made her simultaneously predictable and inflexible. A combination that Harry had learned from Natasha was more dangerous than competent opposition, because competent opposition updated on new information. He arrived in her first class with the Mark III gauntlet in his bag, his full academic preparation done, and the complete patience of someone who had sat across a table from Albus Dumbledore and negotiated terms. "There is no need to use spells in this class," Umbridge had said in her soft educational voice. "You will be learning in a safe, ministry-approved manner. With respect, Professor," Harry had said from the third row pleasantly. "Defensive magic requires practice to be functional in situations where it's needed. Reading about spells is theory. Casting them is skill. They're both necessary and one doesn't substitute for the other." Umbridge had looked at him with her wide toad's eyes. "You disagree with ministry policy, Mr. Potter." "I disagree with the premise that theoretical knowledge of defensive spells constitutes adequate preparation for the situations in which defensive spells are necessary," Harry had said, with the precision of someone who had spent a summer discussing tactics with Tony Stark and a spring discussing policy with Dumbledore. "Those are different things, and conflating them will get students hurt." The classroom had gone very quiet. "I see you have inherited your father's regrettable tendency toward arrogance," Umbridge had said. "My father is Tony Stark," Harry had said mildly, "so you'll have to be more specific." Dumbledore's army had been Hermione's idea and Harry's execution, which was the natural division of their collaboration at this point. Hermione had the organizational architecture and Harry had the training background, and between them they'd run something that was less a secret study group and more a genuine defensive preparation program, held in the Room of Requirement, which Harry had discovered in September, and which had immediately become one of his favorite places in the castle. The room became what you needed it to be. He'd needed a training space, and it had given him something that looked remarkably like Steve's gym on the third floor of the tower, which had made him laugh for the first time in the room's presence, and the room had apparently registered this as positive, because it had added a coffee maker in the corner that produced decent coffee reliably thereafter. He'd taught them what he knew. Not watered down, not in the careful pedagogical sequence of a curriculum, but the way he'd been taught, by doing, by understanding the mechanism, by failing and adjusting and doing again. He taught them the Patronus because Dementors were a real threat, and because the Patronus required the exact muscle of emotional resilience that everything else they might face would also require. He taught them shield charms with the insistence on understanding what a shield was physically doing, not just the wand motion. He taught them bodybind in stunning and disarming, and he made them practice in combinations because the real thing never happened in isolation. He'd watched them grow. Neville Longbottom's development over those months was one of the things he thought about later when people asked him about Hogwarts. Neville had arrived in every class convinced he was bad at magic, which was a conviction so well established that it had become a self-fulfilling architectural feature of his performance. Harry had watched him for the first 4 years and identified it as what Tony called a system with a false limiting constraint, a cap on output that wasn't real, just believed in hard enough to function as real. He pulled Neville aside in October. "You're not bad at magic," Harry had said. "You're bad at magic when you think someone is watching to see if you're bad at magic. That's a completely different problem." Neville had stared at him. "I spent the first 7 years of my life being told I was wrong and strange and too much," Harry had said. "And then I went to live with people who treated the things I was as data points rather than character flaws, and I started being able to use them." He looked at Neville steadily. "You're one of the strongest magical presences in this year. Your plant work is extraordinary. The reason you freeze in other subjects is a performance anxiety loop, not a capability deficit. So we're going to break the loop." "How?" "By putting you in situations where performing matters and letting you perform in them repeatedly until your brain updates its assumptions," Harry had said. "Which is what this group is for." Neville had looked at him with the expression of someone being told something they'd half known for years and never had language for. By February, Neville Longbottom was one of the best casters in the DA. The ministry infiltration in June had been an intelligence failure that Harry took personally for about 48 hours and then converted into a systemic lesson, because Natasha had taught him that operations go wrong, and the question was not how to prevent that but how to recover. He'd known the vision of Sirius was almost certainly false when he'd had it, because his read of Voldemort's approach, from everything Dumbledore had shared from the graveyard, from the quality of the connection between them that he'd been studying theoretically, was that Voldemort didn't take targets. He took access. The vision was access. But he'd also known that if he didn't respond and it turned out to be real and Sirius died because Harry had been too analytical to act, that wasn't a calculation he could make coldly. He'd gone with the appropriate people, Hermione, Ron, Neville, Ginny, Luna, and he'd briefed them properly, which was different from the Chamber of Secrets, different from the graveyard. He told them the risk level honestly. He told them they could stay. None of them had stayed. He'd noted that, filed it. The Ministry had been exactly as Voldemort had intended, a place where Harry would be in the open, depleted, surrounded by people he'd want to protect. What Voldemort had not correctly modeled was that Harry had been in that room for 20 seconds before he'd mapped every exit, located every Death Eater's position, and identified the prophecy sphere as the point of contention. "We're not here for the prophecy," he'd said to his six in the Hall of Prophecy while Death Eaters closed on them through the shelves. "Let them have it. It's already happened. Whatever it says, it's historical record, not operational intelligence. We're here to get out." Hermione had looked at him with her eyebrows fractionally raised, which was her equivalent of a standing ovation. "Agreed," she'd said. "Neville, Luna, cover the left, Ron, Ginny the right, Hermione with me." They'd fought their way out. Not cleanly. There was nothing clean about 6 teenagers against a dozen Death Eaters in a building designed for bureaucracy rather than combat. Ron had got hit with something that made him act strange for 20 minutes. Ginny's ankle was broken, Neville's nose was broken, and Harry had 3 curse impacts on the suit, the Mark III, which he'd been wearing beneath his robes in an undersheath configuration that Tony had designed specifically for Hogwarts concealment requirements. And the suit had handled 2 of them, and the third had scored across his left arm before the shield engaged. The order had arrived. Sirius had arrived. Sirius died anyway, not to a killing curse. To Bellatrix Lestrange's curse at the wrong moment, the curtain, the ancient magic of the veil, the end that had been closer than any of them had been able to see. Harry had seen it happen, had been 10 feet away, and the 30 seconds afterward were something he did not speak about in detail to anyone for a long time. What he did in the immediate aftermath was not chase Bellatrix. The urge was there, violent, complete, cold, and he felt it clearly and chose not to follow it, because chasing Bellatrix served Voldemort's model of him, and he was not going to be what Voldemort's model expected. He stopped at the atrium entrance. He looked at Bellatrix in the open space. "You'll have a chance to answer for that," he said, not a threat, a statement of fact delivered with the same steady quality as all his factual statements. "Not today." Voldemort arrived in the atrium with the specific entrance of someone who had always understood theater. Harry looked at him and felt the cold connection between them spark and hum. Dumbledore arrived 10 seconds later. What happened in the atrium of the Ministry of Magic went into every witness report as extraordinary, which Harry felt was accurate. He hadn't attempted to fight Voldemort. That was not the correct engagement. Not with the Horcruxes still outstanding, not in a public space with civilians present, not without the suit at full operational capability. What he had done was hold the connection between them open, let Voldemort attempt the possession, and then pushed back with every technique Thor and Natasha and 4 years of deliberate training had given him. The key was the memory, not the mirror's image. The real thing, Tony at a workbench at midnight, Bruce making tea, Natasha straightening his collar, Steve's nod, Thor's laugh. All of it simultaneous, held with the precision of a weapon. Voldemort had pulled out. The Ministry officials had arrived to find their Dark Lord retreating through the atrium, Albus Dumbledore standing over a contained duel's aftermath, and Harry Potter standing in the middle of the atrium, 15 years old, bleeding from his left arm through his school robes, looking at the space where Voldemort had been with the expression of someone finishing a calculation rather than surviving a crisis. Fudge had gone pale. "He's back," Harry had said to Fudge, to the officials, to the room, clearly and without inflection. "You've seen him, so now we can stop having that argument and start having the useful one." He'd called Tony from the Ministry bathroom while Madame Pomfrey attended to his arm. "Ministry confrontation," he'd said. "I saw," Tony said. "Friday pulled the news feed. Your arm, cut, not cursed, it's fine." He'd sat on the bathroom counter with his arm wrapped. "Sirius is gone." A long pause. "I know," Tony said quietly. "I need," Harry had started and stopped. "I know," Tony said again. "Come home for the summer, come home first." "Yeah," Harry had said. "Yeah, okay." He'd looked at himself in the Ministry bathroom mirror. a 15-year-old with a scar and green eyes and blood on his sleeve, who had just stood in the same room as Voldemort and come out of it himself. Tony, he'd said, here, it needs to be this year. Harry had said, the suit, this year. I know, Tony had said, I've already started the Mark IV. Summer was grief and engineering in equal measure. Grief for Sirius was the kind that didn't perform itself. It moved through him in the unglamorous way of real loss, in the moments between things, in the specific absence of someone who had been a particular frequency of person that didn't repeat. He'd spent 3 days not in the workshop, which was how Tony knew, because Harry's presence in the workshop was one of the building's constants. He'd spent those 3 days on the roof, or reading or sitting in the common room, while the others moved around him with the careful grace of people who had learned that sometimes the best thing was proximity without pressure. On the 4th day, Tony had knocked on his door. Not going to tell you it gets easier, Tony had said. But I will tell you there's a new problem in the workshop I've been wrong about for 3 days, and I'm considering the possibility that I need a second perspective. Harry had looked at him from his bed. It's the resonance buffer, Tony had said, between the runic array and the arc element modulator. I've tried 4 compositions, and they're all reading hot at the frequency range where your magical output peaks. I think the buffer material needs to have a magical property itself rather than just a conductive one, but I don't know what that property is. Harry had sat up, put his feet on the floor. What temperature is it running hot at? About 40% above target at the 7.3 terahertz band. That's the frequency where involuntary magical output spikes under emotional stress, Harry had said. The buffer needs to dampen the stress response frequencies without affecting the deliberate output frequencies. Thor mentioned an Asgardian compound, Vertherstein Warden Stone. They use it in containment arrays for young Sather practitioners. He'd stood up. I think I have his notes on the composition. Tony had looked at him, had not said anything, had simply waited. Harry had found the notes, brought them to the workshop. They'd spent 14 hours working on the resonance buffer, and somewhere in those 14 hours the grief had not gone away but had found its correct proportion relative to everything else, which was what grief did when you gave it room. The Mark IV was complete by the end of August. It was nothing like the Mark III. Where the Mark III had been a gauntlet, a single piece, powerful and precise but limited in scope, the Mark IV was a system. A full undersuit of interwoven composite material, flexible and warm and lighter than it had any right to be, threaded throughout with the filament array in a distribution pattern that Harry and Bruce had spent 3 weeks modeling. A chest piece housing the arc element and modulator. Gauntlets on both hands, the right one dominant for precision work, the left configured for shield generation. Greaves, boots, a helmet with a heads-up display that Friday could interface with remotely. Shoulder pieces engraved with the runic arrays that Thor and the Asgardian runerites had certified over a 3-day video call that had been one of the stranger experiences of Tony's professional life. The color they'd argued about for a week. Not red and gold, Harry had said immediately when Tony had suggested it. The arc element colors naturally toward. I know what you're doing, Harry had said, and I appreciate it, but I'm not Iron Man Jr. Tony had looked at him. Then, with somewhat more difficulty than the engineering decisions, what do you want? Harry had looked at the suit laid out on the workbench. Black and silver, he'd said, with the runic arrays visible as silver inlay on the chest and gauntlets. It should look like what it is, something that's both. The finished suit was black matte composite with silver runic inlay that caught the light in the way the filament arrays caught it. A chest piece with the modulator visible as a geometric silver pattern over the arc element housing. And a helmet that folded down over his face from a collar piece, with a silence and precision that Tony had spent 3 separate sessions getting right. He'd put it on for the first time in the workshop. All of them present, Tony, Bruce, Natasha, Steve, Thor, Pepper, and Friday had run the full diagnostic and said, all systems reading nominal, arc element at full calibration, runic array resonance stable, magical output interface showing, a brief pause that was not a processing delay, optimal. Harry had raised his right hand. A small, perfectly formed ball of golden light sat in his palm, steady and warm. He shifted frequency. It became silver. He shifted again. It became something that wasn't quite light and wasn't quite fire, but was unmistakably magical. The kind of light that didn't illuminate objects so much as make them fully themselves. He let it go. It floated up toward the workshop ceiling and hovered there. Friday, Tony said quietly, what are the numbers? Magical output is 42% more efficient than unassisted baseline, Friday said. Frequency range is expanded by a factor of 7. The runic arrays are actively interacting with the magical field. They're not just conducting, they're amplifying the precision of the intentional component while dampening the stress response noise. The effect is, another pause, I think the suit is completing the sentences the magic starts. Steve made a sound that wasn't quite words. Thor placed a hand briefly on Harry's shoulder and said nothing, which was more meaningful than whatever words he'd have chosen. Bruce was already pulling up data on his tablet with shining eyes. Natasha looked at Harry from across the workshop with the expression she wore when something went exactly as it should. Pepper said, "Put the helmet on." Harry put the helmet on. The heads-up display came up. Friday's interface, clean and immediate biometric data streaming alongside the suit systems alongside a magical output visualization that mapped his field in real time in shifting silver geometry. He looked at his hands in the suit and through the display saw what they were doing, the constant low-level output that had always been there, the background hum of his magic, now visible, legible, part of the system rather than separate from it. He looked up. Tony was watching him. Through the helmet display, Harry could see his own biometric data. Heart rate, 62. Respiratory rate, 14. Magical output field, stable, expansive, fully his own. He reached out with the magic, not through the suit, through himself, with the suit listening, and every loose object in the workshop rose 6 inches simultaneously and settled back down. "Okay," Harry said, and his voice through the helmet was his voice, unchanged. "Yeah," Tony said. 6th year was Dumbledore's memories, the Horcrux hunt's beginning, and the slow revelation of Snape. Harry had known something was wrong with Dumbledore's hand since September, the blackened skin, the carefully composed way he held it, the slight alteration in his magical signature that Harry's expanded frequency sense picked up in the 2nd week. He'd mentioned it to Dumbledore directly. "A Horcrux," Dumbledore had said. "The ring, I destroyed it. And the curse is managed," Dumbledore had said, which was almost certainly not the complete answer. He looked at Harry with those blue eyes that were more honest now than they'd been in 1st year and more tired. "I have perhaps a year. The reason I have been more urgent this year in sharing what I know with you." Harry had processed this. "The memories," he'd said, "the pensive sessions, you're giving me the complete picture." "I should have done so sooner," Dumbledore had said simply. "Yes," Harry had said without elaboration, because he'd learned from Natasha that sometimes the most powerful response to an acknowledgement was to let it stand. The Horcrux cabinet, Tom Riddle's diary, already destroyed. The ring, already destroyed. The locket, Regulus Black's sacrifice, Creature's story, the real locket retrieved from Grimmauld Place after Harry had a conversation with Creature that he'd approached with the specific respect he'd been taught to give anyone who had survived something terrible and continued to serve through it. The cup, Hufflepuff's, the diadem, the snake. And the one Dumbledore couldn't say directly but said with his eyes when he looked at Harry in those memory sessions, and which Harry had already worked out from first principles and had been sitting with for 3 months before Dumbledore's oblique confirmation. He'd called Tony at 2 in the morning in November. "I need to tell you something," he'd said. "I'm awake," Tony said. "One of the Horcruxes is in me," Harry said. "The night Voldemort's killing curse hit me as a baby and bounced, a piece of his soul attached to me. It's been there for 16 years, it's why I can speak Parseltongue, it's why the connection between us exists." He paused. "It means that as long as it's in me, Voldemort can't die. And the only confirmed method for destroying a Horcrux is something that would also destroy the container." The line was silent for a moment that went on long enough to change its character several times. "No," Tony said, "I'm not saying, Harry." Tony's voice was doing something Harry had only heard it do twice before, both times in situations where something important was at stake. "I need you to listen to me. I'm listening." "That is an engineering problem," Tony said, "not a death sentence. It is a problem and we have 1 year to solve it, and I have the most sophisticated magical technical research facility on the planet and the combined brain trust of Tony Stark and Bruce Banner and an Asgardian prince with access to 3,000 years of Sather scholarship, and I am telling you right now that we are going to solve this problem." Harry sat in the dark of his dormitory. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Tony said. "Now tell me everything Dumbledore has told you about how Horcrux soul fragments interface with a host consciousness. Every detail." Harry told him, everything, for 2 hours. By the end of it, Bruce had been woken up and was already building preliminary models, and Thor had been called at an unreasonable Asgardian hour and had responded to the summary of the problem with a long silence and then, "There is a Sather practice. Soul surgery we would call it, precise extraction of a foreign soul fragment from a living host. It has been done." Another pause. "It requires extraordinary precision." "We have extraordinary precision," Tony had said. "It requires a practitioner of significant power," Thor had said. "We have that too," Tony had said, and had been looking at the holographic display of Harry's magical output profile when he'd said it. Harry had been looking at the ceiling of his dormitory in the dark. "This year," he'd said. "This year," Tony had confirmed. Dumbledore's death came in June on the astronomy tower and Harry was not there in time. He'd been in the castle when the dark mark appeared. He'd been returning from a mission with Dumbledore. The cave, the locket, and Dumbledore had been weakened by the potion, and Harry had been supporting him, and they'd been moving fast and not fast enough. He'd heard the sound of the fight on the tower before he'd cleared the top of the staircase, and he'd moved, and the flash of green light had come through the open tower door before he'd reached it. He stood in the doorway. Dumbledore was gone. Snape was on the battlements above, looking down at where Harry stood in the doorway with the dead weight of the locket, wrong locket, another layer of the problem in his hand. Harry looked at Snape. Snape looked at him. He asked me to, Snape said. His voice was even. His face was doing nothing visible, which Harry had learned was when Snape's face was doing the most. He made the arrangement in October. The curse in his hand was killing him in any case. He chose the manner. Harry said nothing. You're thinking about whether to believe me, Snape said. I already believe you, Harry said. I've been reading your face for 6 years. You're telling the truth. He paused. What else did he ask you to do? Snape studied him from the battlements. The fighting in the castle below was winding down. Harry could hear it, the Death Eaters leaving, having got what they came for. He asked me to keep you alive, Snape said, and to give you the information he couldn't give you himself when the time came. What information? Not tonight, Snape said. He was already moving, and the Death Eaters were at the end of the courtyard, and the window was closing. When it matters, Snape, Harry said. Snape stopped. You've been doing this for a long time, Harry said. Longer than I've been alive. He held the potion's master's gaze. Thank you. Something moved through Snape's expression that Harry catalogued and kept. Then Snape was gone over the battlements, and Harry stood in the astronomy tower doorway with the castle settling into silence beneath him, and the grounds below lit with the retreating figures of Death Eaters, and the night enormous and Scottish and cold, and Albus Dumbledore gone from the world. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he put his earpiece in. Tony, he said. I'm here, Tony said immediately. He'd been watching the castle's magical field signature through Friday's sensors. He knew what had happened. We have a final tally, Harry said. Locket is a fake, the real one's still out there. Diadem is somewhere in the castle. The cup is Bellatrix Lestrange's vault. The snake is with Voldemort. He paused. And me. We've been working on the extraction since November, Tony said. Bruce has a model. Thor's confirmed the theoretical framework. We can build the extraction array this summer. I know, Harry said. One more thing. What? I need you to put the suit on Mark V before September, Harry said. Everything we've been holding in reserve, the secondary runic arrays, the soul ward layer, the frequency expansion module Thor's been working on. I want it all in the next version. A pause. The final version, Tony said. Yes, Harry said. I'll have it done before August, Tony said. Harry, I know, Harry said. I know. He looked at the sky above the astronomy tower, vast, clear, the stars doing their patient and indifferent thing. Somewhere under those stars, Voldemort was making plans around his model of Harry Potter, and his model was wrong, and Harry was going to prove it in a way that couldn't be argued with. He walked back down through the castle, past the portraits that watched him and the ghosts that moved aside and the paintings that murmured, and the castle breathed around him the way it always had, and he pressed his hand briefly to the stone wall in the second-floor corridor and felt the magic in it, layers of it, centuries of students and teachers and stories, and thought, not yet, I'm not done here. The stone was warm beneath his hand. He walked on. Chapter 6, Endgame. There's the Mark V came off the fabricator on the 23rd of August at 3:17 in the morning, and nobody pretended to be asleep. Tony had been in the workshop for 19 consecutive hours. Bruce had gone to bed at midnight and come back at 2. Thor had arrived at Stark Tower the previous afternoon from Asgard with 3 Sather scholars in ceremonial armor who had looked at the runic array schematics on Tony's holographic display and begun making corrections with the focused urgency of people who understood the stakes. Natasha had been sitting at the far workbench for 4 hours doing nothing visible, which meant she was doing several things internally. Steve was in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he'd been holding for Bruce without comment for 40 minutes. Harry stood in front of the suit on its fabrication stand and looked at it. The Mark V was the Mark IV in the same way that a fully grown tree was a seed. The lineage was clear and the difference was everything. It was still black and silver, still the runic arrays visible as inlay on the chest and gauntlets, but the geometry had changed, deepened, the arrays more complex and more dense, working in 3-dimensional patterns that moved slightly when the arc element was active, like script being written in silver light. The helmet had new angles, the visor a deeper silver that would go transparent on activation. The soul ward layer was invisible, threaded into the composite material at the molecular level, a full-body containment field that would, in theory, tell the universe that whatever was inside the suit was integrated and whole and not available for magical targeting. In theory. The extraction array for the Horcrux soul fragment was a separate system, a ring of runic inscriptions on the interior of the chest piece, positioned to interact with the part of Harry's magical signature, where the foreign soul fragment had embedded itself 16 years ago. Thor and the Runerites had spent 3 days on those inscriptions alone. The mechanism was elegant in the way that old and powerful things were elegant, not complicated, just precisely calibrated to do one specific thing completely. "Put it on," Tony said from behind him. Harry turned. Tony was looking at the suit with an expression that was 10 different things at once, and he wasn't managing any of them, which for Tony Stark was the equivalent of having his chest open. "You want to run diagnostics first," Harry said. "Friday already ran diagnostics," Tony said. "6 times, everything's nominal." He met Harry's eyes. "Put it on." Harry put it on. The process was familiar by now. The undersuit first, then the chest piece, then the gauntlets, then the greaves and boots, then the shoulder pieces, and finally the helmet, which folded down from the collar piece with the same silent precision Tony had spent 3 sessions perfecting 2 years ago and had apparently refined further, because it was quieter now, more final, like a key turning in a lock. The HUD came up. Friday's interface. All systems green. And then the soul ward engaged. It was subtle. Not a dramatic shift, not a flash of light or a crack of power. It was more like something settling, like a house finding its foundation. Harry stood in the workshop and felt the magic in him. All of it, his own and the piece that wasn't, and for the first time in his life he could feel them as separate things. His magic and the fragment, like 2 instruments playing different music in the same hall. "Friday," he said, reading the fragment as distinct from your native magical signature. Friday said, "The soul ward is creating a clear delineation. The extraction array is Harry. It's already working at low intensity. It's been in contact for about 40 seconds, and the fragment's integration with your signature has decreased by approximately 3%. Harry looked at his hands. "How long for full extraction?" Bruce asked from somewhere to his left, his voice doing the thing it did when he was controlling the excited physicist very hard. "At current rate, and the rate will likely increase as the array warms up, between 6 and 10 hours of continuous wear," Friday said. The workshop was very quiet. "So," Natasha said from the workbench, "he wears it for the night, and in the morning the Horcrux is gone," Tony said. "And then we find the rest," Harry said. The Runerites exchanged a rapid conversation in Old Norse that Thor translated in a low voice to nobody in particular as, "It is working as designed, the precision is sufficient, the host's native magic is stable." One of them looked at Harry and said something directly to him in Old Norse, and Harry said "tack back," which was "thank you" in Norwegian and close enough to the Asgardian cognate that the Runerite looked briefly pleased. "Where did you learn?" Thor started. "Friday taught me 4 languages last year," Harry said. "Old Norse was one of them." Thor's smile was enormous. "Of course she did." He woke at 7 in the morning with the suit still on and Friday's voice in his ear saying, "Extraction complete. Fragment is gone. Your magical signature is Harry. It's clarified. It reads completely clean." He lay on his back on the workshop floor where he'd been for most of the night, Tony having brought him a blanket at some point that was currently bunched under his head. He looked at the workshop ceiling. He reached for his magic. It was different, not weaker, not stronger exactly. Cleaner was the word, which was the word Friday had used, and it was right. For 16 years there had been a note in the chord that wasn't his, a frequency he'd learned to work around, and now it was gone and the chord was fully his own, and the resonance of it was something he sat with for a long moment without moving because it deserved that. Tony was asleep in his chair at the drafting table, which was where Tony always ended up when he fell asleep in the workshop. Bruce was on the couch, also asleep. Natasha was not visible, which meant she was either in her room or positioned somewhere that she'd determined was more tactically appropriate for the current hour, and both were equally possible. Steve was awake. He was sitting at the kitchen island visible through the workshop door with a cup of coffee, and he looked at Harry when Harry sat up, and Harry gave him a small nod, and Steve gave the nod back, and that was the whole conversation, and it contained everything it needed to. Harry stood up, rolled his shoulders, reached out with the magic, unencumbered, precise, wholly his own, and the 3 empty coffee cups on Tony's workbench rose 6 inches and set themselves down in a neat line. Tony stirred. Opened his eyes, looked at the cups, looked at Harry. "It's done," Tony said. "It's done," Harry said. Tony sat up, ran a hand through his hair. Looked at Harry for a long moment with dark eyes that were doing the morning version of their calculations, slower, more honest in the way that pre-coffee things tended to be honest. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like myself," Harry said, "all the way through." Tony looked at him for another moment. Then he picked up one of the 3 coffee cups and held it up, a small and entirely genuine gesture. "Then let's go finish this," he said. The Horcrux hunt took 4 months. Locket, Grimald Place, exactly where Creature had hidden it after Regulus's mission. Harry had sat with Creature for an hour first, listening to the full story with the patience he'd learned from Thor and the respect he'd learned from Steve, and Creature had told him everything and given him the locket with the gravity of someone completing a commission long overdue. Harry had thanked him properly. The look on Creature's face had been something he remembered. He destroyed the locket in the workshop with the gauntlet at full precision output. The magical field focused to a single point, and the soul fragment inside it had screamed and gone, and Harry had felt it go without flinching. Cup, Gringotts. Harry had planned it for 3 weeks, not with a dragon escape, but with a meeting. He'd walked into Gringotts with a letter from his Gringotts account manager and a proposal that had taken 5 drafts and Hermione's editorial precision to get right, essentially. We know what's in Bellatrix Lestrange's vault, we know what it is, we know you didn't put it there, and we'd like to remove it without involving dragons or property damage. The goblin who'd read the proposal had been silent for a long time, and then had said in gobbledygook that they found the proposal acceptable and the alternative significantly less preferable. Hermione, who'd been sitting beside Harry and had studied gobbledygook for 4 months, had translated this and then said to Harry quietly, "I think that went well." Harry had agreed. The cup had come back to the workshop. He destroyed it. Another scream. Another fragment gone. Diadem, the room of requirement where it had always been, in the room of hidden things under a pile of objects deposited by centuries of students who needed to hide something. Harry had found it in 40 minutes using the full frequency range of the suit's sensing capability, a silver signal singing in the accumulated magical noise of the room. Destroyed it. Another fragment. Snake, Nagini was the hardest calculation, because destroying the snake meant exposing to Voldemort that the Horcruxes were being hunted, which would trigger defensive responses. Harry had spent 3 weeks on the timing question with Natasha, who approached it as the strategic intelligence problem it was. "You want him to know before the confrontation or not know?" she'd asked. "I want him to know on my timeline," Harry said, "not his." "Then the snake has to be the last Horcrux before the confrontation," she said. "In the confrontation itself. Which means the confrontation has to happen in a space where the snake is present and where I have a clean shot," Harry said. "Where does he feel most powerful?" Harry thought about it. "Hogwarts," he said. "He never finished there, he never conquered it. It's the one place he couldn't own and it's been under Death Eater control for a year." He paused. "He'll come for it, he just needs a reason." Natasha looked at him. "What's the reason?" "Me," Harry said. Harry sent the letter to Snape on a Monday in May. Snape was at Hogwarts. The Death Eaters were at Hogwarts. The school had been under the Carrow's casual cruelty for an academic year that had done something to the stones of the place. Something Harry could feel from the edge of the grounds when he crossed the wards. A heaviness, an accumulated wrong that the castle's patient magic was bearing with the stoicism of something very old and very certain of its own nature. The letter said, "I'm coming back. Have whatever conversation you need to have. Tonight." He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. The response came through Snape's patroness, a doe which Harry had been told about, which he looked at and felt the layered sorrow of in 3 words, "The school waits." He gathered his people, not an army. Not yet, the army was already inside the castle, the DA, the Order, everyone who'd been building and preparing and surviving the year under Death Eater occupation. What Harry gathered was his. Hermione, who arrived at the Hogsmeade apparition point with a beaded bag full of everything relevant and the expression of someone who had already thought through the next 14 steps. Ron, who shook Harry's hand and then said, "That's stupid, come here," and hugged him briefly. Natasha, who had been there already, had arrived 2 hours early and had spent the time identifying every approach to Hogsmeade from 3 different directions. Thor, who landed in the field outside the village at sunset in full Asgardian armor with Mjolnir and the specific quality of presence that meant not staying back. Tony's voice in his earpiece, "I'm here." "You're in New York," Harry said. "Friday has full sensor coverage on the valley. I have eyes on you. I'm here." Steve's voice, "All of us are." Harry stood at the edge of Hogsmeade in the May evening with the Mark V on under his traveling cloak, the arc element warm and present in his chest, the magic running clean and full and entirely his own. He reached up and took the cloak off. "We going in hot?" Ron asked. "We're going in clearly," Harry said. "I want everyone in that castle who's been afraid for a year to see us walk in. I want the Death Eaters to see us walk in." He looked at Natasha. "I want Voldemort to hear about it before we reach the gate." "That's a message," Natasha said. "Yes," Harry said. "What's the message?" "That we're not sneaking," Harry said. "That this ends tonight on our terms." They walked through Hogsmeade with the Mark V visible, helmet down, the silver runic arrays catching the early moonlight, and the word ran ahead of them like fire in dry grass. Through the pub and the closed shops and the watchful shadows, and somewhere in the castle a dark presence felt the shift in the air and turned its attention south. Good, Harry thought, come find out. The castle erupted around them when they crossed the gates. Not in the way of a crisis, in the way of a home recognizing something. The suits of armor straightened, the portraits turned. The ghosts converged from various parts of the building with the specific urgency of people who had things to report. And the first person Harry encountered in the entrance hall was Neville Longbottom, broader across the shoulders than he'd been 6 months ago, with a cut over his left eye and his wand out and an expression that was solid and certain and nothing like first year. "Harry," Neville said. "Neville." Harry put his hand briefly on Neville's shoulder. "How bad is it?" "The Carrows have been contained," Neville said, and the flatness in his voice told a story about what that year had been and what it had taken. "McGonagall has the staff. The students are in the Great Hall." He looked at the suit. "That's new. That's the plan," Harry said. Neville looked at it for another moment. "Right," he said. "What do you need from us?" "Everyone who can fight, organized by McGonagall's judgment into positions along the castle's defensive lines. Anyone who can't fight, underground passages or out of her fourth tunnel is still open." He met Neville's eyes. "And someone needs to find and destroy an old diadem in the Room of Hidden Things." "I know roughly where it is. I can give you the magical signature." "I know where it is," Neville said. Harry looked at him. "Been mapping the castle for a year," Neville said, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who had spent a year making use of available time. "Been in that room 50 times. I know where everything is." Harry felt something that was pride and something that was gratitude and something that was the recognition of what a year of choosing to get up looked like in a person. "Then go get it," Harry said. "You'll need something that can destroy it. Basilisk venom, fiendfire if you can control it." "I've been working on fiendfire control for 4 months, Neville said, and walked away with the purpose of someone who had already decided the outcome. McGonagall was exactly as Harry had expected and needed her to be. She met him in the Great Hall with the school assembled behind her, staff in position, faces showing the full range of what a year of occupation looked like, and she looked at Harry with those sharp eyes that had been measuring him since first year and said, "You have a plan." "I have the framework of one," Harry said, because she deserved honesty. "Voldemort will come to the castle. He wants to reclaim it as a statement of power. It's the one significant institution in the wizarding world that has never submitted to him. When he comes, I need to be the reason he's here, and I need the castle's defenders to hold the perimeter long enough for me to deal with the Horcrux issue." "The snake," McGonagall said. "The snake," Harry confirmed. "And then it's just him," Harry said, "and me." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complex in the way that long relationships between people who have watched each other become themselves were complex. "What do you need from me?" "Hold the castle," Harry said, "and trust your students. They're ready." McGonagall straightened. "Mr. Potter," she said with the voice she used when she meant to be heard by a room, "whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that we are not protecting you. We are fighting with you." The hall was very quiet. "I know," Harry said. "That's what makes it work." Voldemort's arrival was announced by silence. It happened in waves, the owls first, then the frogs near the lake, then the castle's own ambient magical field compressing slightly, the way a room felt before a storm. Harry was on the battlements of the astronomy tower, where Dumbledore had died, where Snape had told him a truth, where the view of the grounds was best, and he felt it through the suit's sensing array before anyone else reported it. The Dark Lord moving through the grounds like a stain, his signature enormous and cold and fractured in the particular way of a soul that had been divided too many times, and behind him the Death Eaters in their hundreds and the creatures that served them and the specific wrongness of Dementors moving over the outer grounds. "Friday," Harry said. "I have him," Friday said. 240 meters northeast approach. "The snake is with him," confirmed 15 meters to his left, moving parallel. "His magical signature is Harry. It's significant, higher output than the graveyard reading." "He's at full strength," Tony said through the earpiece. "I know," Harry said. "The suit's reading stable. The soul ward is nominal." A pause. "Harry, yeah, remember what I said about the armor?" "I know what the armor is for," Harry said. "I'm saying remember what I said about what the armor isn't for. It's not for making you feel safe enough to be reckless. It's for making you safe enough to be precise," Harry said. "Precise," Tony agreed. Below, the fighting had started at the perimeter, the crack and flash of spells across the grounds, the castle's enchantments engaging, the stone walls doing what stone walls had been doing for 1,000 years. Harry watched it for a moment, the whole vast shape of the battle, and then found Voldemort's position in the moving chaos and began to move. He found Snape first. Snape was in the second-floor corridor alone, moving away from the main, fighting toward the east wing with the purpose of someone who knew where they were going. He turned when Harry fell into step beside him. "The snake," Harry said. "He keeps it close," Snape said, "when he's in direct confrontation. He knows it's a Horcrux, he knows you know. He'll keep it within his own protection field. Which means to get to the snake I need to get past his personal shields." "Yes, what does he respond to?" Snape looked at him sideways as they moved. "What do you mean?" "Emotionally," Harry said. "He's a brilliant tactician, but he has responses. Things that override the calculation. What are they?" A pause. "Contempt," Snape said. "He cannot operate fully in the presence of genuine contempt for his power. Not anger, anger feeds him. Not fear, fear pleases him. Contempt, it breaks his composure. Another pause, and uncertainty. He has not been uncertain in 20 years. Anything that makes him uncertain breaks the pattern, Harry said. I can work with that. There is one more thing, Snape said and stopped walking. Harry stopped too. They were in the corridor outside the defense classroom, and through the window the grounds below were lit with spellfire, and Snape looked at him with those black eyes that Harry had been reading for 6 years and finding less empty every year. Dumbledore wanted you to know, Snape said, and from inside his robes he produced a small vial of silver memory. That he considered you. He stopped, visibly recalibrated. He said that if he could have chosen the conclusion to his design, he would have chosen this. You as you are, not as he planned. Harry took the vial, looked at it. He also said, Snape continued, with the particular precision of someone delivering an exact message they've been holding for months. Tell him that the love is not a liability. It never was. Lily knew that. Tell him she was right. Harry stood in the corridor with the vial in his hand and felt the weight of it. Lily Potter's sacrifice, Dumbledore's long penance, Snape's longer one, all of it converging in this moment in this corridor with the castle shaking around them. He put the vial in his chest piece. Thank you, he said, for all of it, from the beginning. Snape's expression was not soft. It was something else, harder than soft and more honest, the expression of someone who has stopped performing a version of themselves and is simply standing in the actual version. Go end it, Snape said. He came out through the main doors at the moment of stillness. There was a moment, brief, 10 seconds, between one wave of the battle and the next, where the grounds went quiet in the particular way of large engagements catching their breath, and Harry walked through the main doors of Hogwarts in the Mark V with the helmet up and the runic arrays burning silver-white in the dark, and the battle stopped. Both sides. For 10 seconds, everyone on those grounds, Order members, Death Eaters, students, creatures, and the enormous cold presence of Voldemort himself turning at the edge of the Forbidden Forest, was looking at the same thing. A figure in black and silver standing at the top of the castle steps, the arc element casting a clean geometric glow through the chest piece, the runic arrays moving in their living patterns, the whole thing radiating a quality that was not intimidation, not aggression, but the simple, undeniable presence of someone who had decided where they were and why. That's enough, Harry said, and his voice through the helmet's amplification carried across the grounds the way voices could carry when backed by a certain quality of conviction. Let's finish this. Voldemort's response was not immediate. Harry watched him across 200 meters of open ground and read the pause accurately, not hesitation from fear, but the recalibration of a genuinely intelligent enemy updating on new information. The cold eyes were doing what they'd done in the Chamber of Secrets, trying to categorize. Harry Potter, Voldemort said, and his voice carried too effortlessly the dark version of the same skill. You have been busy. Productive summer, Harry said. Horcruxes, not a question. All of them, Harry said, except the one you're carrying. Nagini raised her enormous head beside Voldemort, and the Death Eaters shifted, and somewhere in the castle behind Harry there was a sound like fire, which was Neville Longbottom in the room of requirement doing what he'd spent 4 months preparing to do. And Harry felt the diadem's fragment vanish, a distant pulse, a screaming diminishment in the world's magical field, and Voldemort felt it too. His face changed. Not to fear, to fury, and underneath the fury, at the very bottom, the first genuine uncertainty Harry had ever sensed from him. Now, Harry said to the earpiece to all of them. The grounds exploded. The Order and the DA came from the castle behind him, McGonagall at the front with the specific fearlessness of someone who has decided that some things are worth standing in front of. Thor came down from the sky like a weather event, Mjolnir throwing lightning across the Death Eater lines, and the roar of it shook the stones. Natasha was already in the Death Eater formation, had been for 3 minutes, had gotten there during the stillness, moving through their lines the way she moved through everything, and people were going down without knowing what had hit them. Harry was moving toward Voldemort. The spells came immediately. Harry had trained for this for 5 years, not academically, not theoretically, but in the specific and demanding reality of actual magical combat at actual speed. The suit's shield absorbed the first 3. He bent the 4th with his right gauntlet, redirecting its trajectory the way you redirected a blow in sparring, along the line of its own force, not against it. The 5th he stepped through, the soul ward flaring as it hit, and felt it dissolve against the ward's field like water against glass. Death Eaters between him and Voldemort tried to intervene. He moved through them with the economy of someone for whom every motion was the result of 8 years of training by people who took movement seriously. He wasn't brutal, he was efficient, which was a different thing. Binding spells, stunning spells, magical force used to create space and maintain forward momentum. He didn't stop for any of them. Voldemort met him when he was 30 feet away, and the duel that followed was unlike anything described in any account of magical combat Harry had ever read. Because Voldemort was extraordinary. That was the truth that had to be acknowledged. The man had been the most feared dark wizard in a century for reasons that were real. And at full strength with his cold and fractured magic, he was a force of genuine and terrible power. The killing curses came in combinations, in traps, in angles that assumed Harry would move predictably. The dark magic he deployed was the kind that had been designed over decades to kill quickly and specifically. And Harry didn't die. The soul ward held. Twice it engaged directly against killing curse impacts, green light hitting the suit and dispersing into the ward's field. The magic trying to find a soul to sever and finding only the ward's clear message that the soul inside was integrated and whole and protected. Voldemort's expression when the first killing curse failed was the most useful thing Harry had seen all night. The fracture in the certainty, the break in the model. Uncertain, Harry thought. He pressed it. You built your power on the idea that death was the ultimate threat, Harry said between exchanges, moving constantly, reading Voldemort the way he'd been taught to read everything, through the mechanism, through the body language, through the decision tree that was visible in his motion. You made yourself unkillable so you didn't have to be afraid of it, but you're still afraid. You've always been afraid. Everything you've built is about managing the fear. He watched Voldemort's face. It hasn't worked. You're still Tom Riddle, still afraid in Wool's orphanage, still looking for the thing that makes you permanent. Silence, Voldemort said, and there was something in the word that was different from commanding, something that was the register of a person hearing something true. I'm not angry at you, Harry said, which was the most destabilizing thing he could have said, and he knew it, and he said it precisely because it was also completely true. You made a choice when you were young about what to do with a particular kind of pain. It was the wrong choice, and it hurt a lot of people, and it's going to end tonight. But I'm not angry about it. He held Voldemort's gaze across 15 feet of scorched ground. That's what you can't model. Everyone else is afraid of you or in awe of you or furious at you. He raised the gauntlet, feeling the magic running clean and full and completely his own, need you to be finished. Voldemort attacked with everything. It was extraordinary to experience, the full output of one of the most powerful magical beings alive directed at a single point. The air between them distorted. The ground cracked. Harry was driven back 3 steps, the suit systems running hot as they managed the input, Friday's voice in his ear saying, shield load at 73%, 78%, the soul ward is. And then the ward pulsed once, a full-body engagement that Harry felt as something like the moment in sparring when all the weight lands and you decide not to fall. He didn't fall. He pushed. The full output of the Mark V, the complete frequency range, every runic array active simultaneously. The arc element and the magic running as one system the way they had been building toward for 5 years. He pushed through Voldemort's attack and past it, and the push was not simply force, it was the specific thing Thor had taught him about Sather, the thing that real power was, not what you force on the world, but what you invite the world to be. He invited the world to be finished with this. The magical shockwave when their outputs met fully was the kind of event that ended up in the magical world's historical record, and that Tony would later describe, reviewing Friday's sensor data, as the single largest voluntary magical output I've ever measured, which given some of our calibration sessions is saying something very serious. In the moment, it was white light and the sound of something fundamental resolving. And then he had 1 second, one precise second in the aftermath, while Voldemort was staggered, while the Death Eaters around them were down or retreating, while the Order and the DA were holding the line behind him, and he reached with the right gauntlet at full precision frequency for Nagini. The snake died cleanly and quickly, the magical instrument of the gauntlet's precision working through its scales to the soul fragment nested in it, and the fragment went like all the others, a scream that diminished, a pulse in the magical field, a vanishing. Voldemort felt it. He looked at Harry, and what was in his face was not the cold fury of the earlier engagement. It was something rawer than that. Something that might have been, in another life and a different series of choices, the recognition of someone who understood they had reached the end. It's done, Harry said. It's all done. There's nowhere left to go. You can't, Voldemort started and stopped, because the sentence had no ending anymore, no completion, the logic of it broken by the absence of the Horcruxes, by the soul that was whole and singular and diminished to its final fragment. I know what you're afraid of, Harry said gently. I think you've always known someone would, eventually. He raised the gauntlet one last time. The spell he used was not the killing curse. He would not use it, had never used it, would never use it, because the choice of how to end something was as important as the reason for ending it. And Tony had taught him that you were always building something, even in the act of destruction, and what you built was what you would have to stand in afterward. He used the expelliarmus that had been his first learned spell and his consistent choice, the one that people had called too gentle for the kind of war he was fighting, the one he'd kept because it was his. Voldemort's wand left his hand. Without the wand, without the Horcruxes, without the power structures that had held his fractured soul in place, the rest followed. Not violently, with the quiet finality of something that had been resisting its own ending for 50 years and had simply run out of the resistance. The body that had been reconstructed in a graveyard, held together by dark magic and singular will, completed the process that had begun the night a mother died for her child. Tom Riddle's story ended in a field outside Hogwarts Castle at 3:42 a.m. on a May morning, without thunder or ceremony, while the stars continued their patient and indifferent occupation of the sky. Harry stood in the silence afterward with the gauntlet at his side, and the runic arrays still faintly luminous in the pre-dawn dark. He heard the castle behind him. The noise of it, voices, movement, the specific human sound of aftermath of people who had been holding something releasing it. McGonagall's voice giving orders. Thor's laugh somewhere distant, which was a sound that couldn't coexist with the end of the world, and was therefore proof that it hadn't ended. Ron saying something to Hermione in the urgent, low voice of people who'd been through something together. He heard Tony in his ear. Friday's reading nominal, Tony said. Suit is intact. Your biometrics are, Harry. Your magical output is reading the cleanest I've ever measured. It's just you. It's just me, Harry agreed. You okay? Harry looked at the field, at the sky, at the castle with all its windows burning warm and yellow against the dark. Yeah, he said. I'm landing in 20 minutes, Tony said. I have the Quinjet. I was going to stay in New York and watch on sensors, but then I was already in the Quinjet, so. Harry smiled. Yeah, don't argue with me about it. I'm not arguing. You were going to. I wasn't, Harry said. I wanted you here. A pause. 20 minutes, Tony said, and there was everything in his voice that he never said directly, all of it all at once. I'll be here, Harry said. Hermione found him first. He was sitting on the steps of the castle, helmet off, the suit's chest piece open to the night air, the arc elements glow mixing with the first gray of dawn on the eastern horizon. She sat beside him without asking if it was all right too, which was exactly correct. She didn't say anything for a while either, and that was exactly correct too. It's strange, she said, eventually. What is? I've been preparing for this since first year, she said, everything pointing at it. And now it's done and I keep waiting for the thing after it, like there has to be a thing after it. There is, Harry said. That's the good news. There are a lot of things after it. She looked at him. Her face in the early light was tired and genuine and precisely itself. Are you all right, really? Really, Harry said. The soul fragment is gone. The fight is done. The people I love are alive. He paused. Sirius isn't. Cedric isn't. Fred. He stopped. Ron had told him about Fred 30 minutes ago, and he'd carried it quietly and was still carrying it. There are people who are gone, and that's permanent, and I'm going to feel that properly. He looked at the sky. But I'm all right. You're going to have to do about 1,000 interviews, Hermione said. I know. And the ministry is going to want to give you a medal. I know. And Dumbledore's portrait's going to be very talkative about how things unfolded. I am aware. And the magical world is going to want to make you into a symbol. Harry looked at her. What am I going to do about that? Hermione's expression was the one that preceded something she'd been thinking about for a while. Be annoyingly specific, she said. Every time they try to make you into a symbol, be a specific, awkward, difficult, individual person. Talk about the suit as an engineering project. Talk about your dad. Talk about S.H.I.E.L.D. Make yourself too real to be a symbol. A beat. I've been thinking about going into magical law reform, specifically around the treatment of magical beings and the legal accountability structures for institutions that misuse power. She paused. I'd want a partner, someone who understood both worlds. Harry looked at her. Not romantically, she said with the precision of someone forestalling a misunderstanding. Partners, colleagues. The kind who argue all the time and get things done. Like Bruce and Tony, Harry said. Exactly like Bruce and Tony, yes, he thought about it. The magical world and the non-magical world, the gap between them, the things that happened in that gap that had happened to him as a child and to countless others. The treatment of beings the magical world had decided were lesser, the ministry's refusal to be accountable, the structures that Dumbledore had worked around rather than worked to change. I'm in, he said. Hermione smiled fully, without restraint, a rare gift. Good. Tony landed the Quinjet on the grounds as the sun came fully up. Harry walked down the steps to meet him. Tony came down the ramp in his own suit, mark whatever he was on now. Tony had stopped giving them numbers Harry could track and then retracted it to the bracelets, which meant he was doing this as himself, not as Iron Man, which was a distinction Tony made deliberately and meaningfully. They met in the middle of the field. Tony looked at the suit, looked at Harry. Looked at the castle behind him and the groups of people visible on the grounds and the specific quality of the morning, which was the quality of a morning after something long has ended. The suit worked, Tony said. The suit worked, Harry confirmed. The soul ward, held against 2 direct killing curse impacts. Tony let out a slow breath. Good, that's good. The math was right. He looked at Harry. The extraction, clean. Harry tapped his chest. Nothing left but me. Tony nodded slowly, multiple times, the kind of nodding that was doing something other than agreeing with information. Harry closed the distance and hugged him the way he'd hugged him at King's Cross 8 years ago, arms around him properly, and Tony made the same sound he'd made that morning, the sound of someone caught off guard by something they'd wanted, and hugged him back with the force of someone who had been watching on sensors for 3 hours and was converting that into something physical. You scared the hell out of me, Tony said into his shoulder. Multiple times over multiple years. I want you to know that's a compounding problem. I know, Harry said. I built you the suit. The suit worked. I'm prepared to acknowledge that the suit working was the plan and the plan worked and I was. Tony stopped. I was worried. I know, Harry said. I know you were. I'm okay. You're okay. I'm okay. Tony pulled back, looked at him. You're really okay. I am really, Harry said, completely okay. Tony looked at him for one more moment, doing all his calculations, and whatever they returned came out in a single breath, a long one, the kind that held several months of compressed anxiety. Then he said, good, now. The runic arrays, Friday logged something during the peak engagement that I want to go through with you. There was an interaction between the array and your native output at the frequency peak that I didn't model. I want to know if you felt it on your end, because from the sensor data it looked like, Tony, Harry said. It looked like the arrays were responding to the output pattern rather than just conducting it, which would mean the runes have developed a dynamic relationship with your specific magical signature that, Tony, which is extraordinary, genuinely extraordinary from an engineering standpoint because the implication is that the suit has, Dad, Harry said. Tony stopped. He looked at Harry. Eat something first, Harry said. We can look at the data tonight. You haven't eaten in 14 hours, Friday told me. Tony opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the castle, at the field, at the morning and all the people moving through it, alive and purposeful and themselves. Pepper packed food in the Quinjet, he said. I know, Harry said. She told me. She's also going to be when we get back. She's going to. I know, Harry said. Come on. He walked back toward the castle with Tony beside him. And the morning was full of noise and people and the specific kind of exhausted exhilaration of something done. And the castle's windows caught the sun. And Thor was telling a story to a group of stunned sixth years near the lake. And Natasha was somewhere Harry couldn't see yet but would find him soon. And Hermione was already talking to someone in the entrance hall with the purposeful gestures of a person who had already begun. And behind him the field was empty and quiet and finally, simply, still. He pressed his hand to the castle wall as he went in. The stone was warm. Something in the depths of the castle's old and layered magic shifted, recognized, settled. Not the way it had settled in the years of darkness and occupation. The way it had settled on the night a freckled red-haired boy had first arrived here centuries ago, or the night the first Muggle-born had crossed the grounds, or every morning of every year that a student had walked through these doors not knowing yet what they were and found out. Something patient and certain. Something that had always been going to be exactly this. Harry walked through the doors of Hogwarts into the morning and the light and the noise of his people. And the war was done, and his name was Harry Potter Stark, and he was 19 years old, and he was exactly himself, and the world was full of things to build. The suit's final diagnostic read nominal. The runic arrays Friday logged had done something she noted in a new file category she labeled, Magic Learning the Machine Learning the Magic. She sent the file to Tony and Bruce with a brief annotation. I think this one is important. Tony read it at 7 a.m. with a cup of coffee, read it 3 times, and then sent it to Bruce with one word, obviously. Bruce read it, annotated 17 sections, and forwarded it to Thor with the note. The suit is, technically speaking, alive. Thor's response arrived 3 hours later in Old Norse, which Friday translated as, all the best things are, tell Harry I said so. Harry was asleep in Gryffindor Tower, in the bed he'd had since first year, the gauntlet on the desk and the Asgardian stone on the windowsill, when Friday whispered the message through his earpiece. He smiled in his sleep and didn't wake up. Outside the window, Scotland was very large and very green and very much itself, and the sky above it was the particular blue of mornings that intend to be good ones. It was.